Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is David Jones, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness surrounding Mount Katahdin in northern Maine, where the ancient Penobscot legends warn of the Wendigo that stalks the endless forests. The three of us had been planning this backpacking trip for months. Marcus Rivera, my college roommate turned software engineer, had been working 90-hour weeks and desperately needed to disconnect. Sarah Chen, our mutual friend from hiking club, was dealing with her recent divorce and jumped at the chance to lose herself in the wilderness. Me? I was running from the suffocating fluorescent maze of my accounting firm, where every day felt like drowning in beige mediocrity. We drove up to Millinocket on a gray October Friday, the kind of day where the sky pressed down like a dirty wool blanket. The plan was simple. 3 days of backcountry camping in the 100-mile wilderness, starting from the Apple Stream area and working our way through some of the most isolated terrain in the lower 48. No cell service, no people, just us and the vast emptiness of the North Woods. Jesus, it's like driving into the end of the world, Marcus muttered, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as we passed another abandoned logging road disappearing into the tree line. The maples and birches had already shed most of their leaves, leaving skeletal branches that clawed at the pewter sky. Only the dark spruces retained their needles, standing like mourners at a funeral. Sarah was studying her topographical maps in the passenger seat, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. According to this, once we're 5 miles in, we won't see another human soul for days. Perfect. There was something brittle in her voice, an edge that hadn't been there before her marriage imploded. I parked at the trailhead parking area, a small dirt lot surrounded by towering white pines that whispered secrets in the wind. The silence hit us immediately when we stepped out, not peaceful quiet, but an oppressive absence of sound that seemed to swallow our voices. Even our footsteps on the frost-brittle ground sounded muffled, wrong somehow. "Phones are already dead," Marcus announced, holding up his device. "No bars whatsoever." "Mine too," Sarah confirmed. "Good thing we brought the GPS unit and compass." I checked my phone. Not just no signal, the battery indicator showed empty despite being fully charged that morning. "That's weird. Mine was at 100% when we left the hotel." Marcus shrugged it off. "Probably the cold. Electronics get wonky in low temperatures." We shouldered our packs and headed into the forest. The trail was well marked at first, blazed trees and clear pathways that gave us confidence. But as we hiked deeper, the blazes became fewer and more faded. The undergrowth pressed closer, branches snagging at our gear with grasping fingers. The first sign something was wrong came after we'd been hiking for 2 hours. Sarah was leading, following what we thought was the trail, when she stopped abruptly. "This doesn't match the map," she said, spreading the topographical chart across a fallen log. "We should have crossed Apple Stream by now, but I haven't seen any water." Marcus and I gathered around, studying the contour lines and trail markings. According to our route, we should have been following the stream north for the past mile. "Maybe we missed a turn," I suggested, though the trail had been fairly straightforward. "Or maybe the map's wrong," Marcus said. "These things aren't always accurate in remote areas." Sarah's jaw tightened. "The USGS doesn't make mistakes like this. We're definitely off trail." We backtracked for 20 minutes but couldn't find where we'd gone wrong. The path behind us looked exactly like the path ahead, a narrow corridor through increasingly dense forest where the trees seemed to lean inward, creating a tunnel of shadows even in the afternoon light. "Let's just keep going," Marcus said, consulting his GPS unit. "We'll camp wherever we find good water and figure it out tomorrow." But the GPS was showing our location as a blank space. No topographical features, no trail markers, just an empty void on the digital map. "Technology," Marcus muttered, giving the device a shake. "Can't trust it." We pressed on, and I began to notice other wrongness seeping in around the edges. The forest was too quiet. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The few squirrels we glimpsed moved with jerky, unnatural motions, their eyes reflecting light in a way that made my skin crawl. When we finally found water, a narrow creek that gurgled over moss-covered rocks, the sun was already sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky the color of old blood. We set up camp in a small clearing beside the stream, but something felt off about the space. The ground was perfectly level, as if it had been artificially flattened, and the trees formed an almost perfect circle around us. "This is nice," Sarah said, but her voice carried that same brittle quality. She kept glancing over her shoulder as she unpacked her gear. The temperature dropped fast once the sun disappeared. By the time we'd eaten our freeze-dried meals and started a fire, our breath was forming white clouds in the beam of my headlamp. The flames danced strangely, occasionally flickering green or blue before returning to normal orange. "Did you guys see that?" I asked after the third color change. "See what?" Marcus was programming his GPS again, muttering about satellite connectivity. "The fire. It keeps changing colors." Sarah looked up from her sleeping bag. "Wood's probably wet. Makes flames burn funny colors sometimes. But I'd been camping since I was a kid, and I'd never seen flames dance like this, writhing and twisting as if they were alive, reaching toward us with hungry fingers before snapping back. The first night passed without incident, though I woke several times to strange sounds from the forest. Not animal noises, but something that sounded almost like whispered conversations just beyond the edge of hearing. Each time I strained to listen, the sounds would stop, leaving only the babble of the creek and my own hammering heartbeat. Morning brought no relief. My sleeping bag was damp with condensation that had no business being there in the dry October air, and my water bottles had developed a thin film of ice despite being inside the tent with me. Worse, our food had an odd smell to it. Not spoiled exactly, but wrong somehow. Like meat that had been left out just long enough to start turning. "We need to get back to the main trail," Sarah announced over breakfast. Her face was pale, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she'd slept as poorly as I had. "Something's not right about this place." Marcus laughed, but it sounded forced. "Come on, guys. It's just the wilderness. No hot showers, no Starbucks. Of course it feels wrong if you're used to civilization." "It's not that," I said. "Listen." We all fell silent. The absence of sound was total. No wind in the trees, no water sounds from the creek that had been babbling all night, no insect hum. Even our own breathing seemed muffled, as if the air itself was too thick. "Okay, that's genuinely creepy," Marcus admitted. Sarah was already stuffing her sleeping bag into its compression sack. "We're leaving, now." But when we shouldered our packs and tried to retrace our steps, the forest had changed. The path we'd followed to reach the clearing was gone, replaced by impenetrable undergrowth. Every direction looked identical. Dark corridors between ancient trees whose bark was scored with marks that looked uncomfortably like claw scratches. "This is impossible," Sarah said, consulting her compass. The needle spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. Compasses don't just stop working. Marcus's GPS showed the same blank void as yesterday. Must be solar flare activity or something, messing with the satellites. We picked a direction that seemed promising and started walking. After an hour, we emerged into the exact same clearing where we'd camped. Our fire ring was still there, cold ashes arranged in patterns that I swore hadn't been there when we left. "We're going in circles," I said, fighting down a bubble of panic. "No," Sarah said firmly. "That's impossible. I've been marking trees as we go." She pointed to blazes she'd made with her knife, but they were facing the wrong direction, as if we'd approached the clearing from the opposite side. We tried again, this time marking our path more carefully. The result was the same. No matter which direction we chose, we ended up back at the clearing. The marked trees appeared in places they shouldn't have been, and our own footprints formed impossible loops that doubled back on themselves. By the third attempt, the sun was setting again, and something new had appeared in our campsite. A fourth tent, identical to Sarah's but with subtle differences in the wear patterns. Inside was gear that looked exactly like ours but felt wrong to the touch. Sleeping bags that were too cold, water bottles that tasted of copper and decay. "Where did this come from?" Marcus asked, his voice cracking. None of us had an answer. We set up our fire again, using wood from the same deadfall pile that somehow never seemed to diminish no matter how much we burned. The flames danced their unnatural colors, and in their light, the scratch marks on the surrounding trees seemed to move and shift. That night I woke to the sound of Marcus talking to someone outside the tent. His voice was calm, conversational, as if he was chatting with an old friend. "Yeah, I understand. It's better this way. Cleaner." I unzipped my tent flap and peered out. Marcus was sitting by the dead fire, his back to me, speaking to empty air. But as I watched, his shadow, cast by moonlight that shouldn't have been bright enough, was wrong. Instead of matching his seated posture, the shadow was standing, arms spread wide as if embracing something. "Marcus," I whispered. He turned toward me and his face was a mask of bland contentment that didn't belong to my anxiety-ridden friend. "Go back to sleep, David. Everything's fine now." His eyes reflected the moonlight like an animal's. I retreated into my tent and lay awake until dawn, listening to Marcus continue his conversation with nothing. Sometimes a second voice seemed to answer him, too low to make out words, but with a cadence that suggested vast age and terrible hunger. In the morning, Marcus appeared normal again, making coffee over our restored fire and complaining about his sore back from sleeping on the ground. But when I looked at him in full daylight, there were subtle changes. His movements were too fluid, too purposeful. He blinked less frequently, and when he smiled, it lasted just a fraction too long. "How'd you sleep?" he asked, and his voice was exactly right except for a slight echo, as if the words were being repeated by something speaking from inside his chest. "Fine," I lied. Sarah emerged from her tent, looking haggard. "We need to discuss what's happening here," she said without preamble. "This isn't natural. Forests don't rearrange themselves. Compasses don't just stop working. And there's something wrong with—" She looked at Marcus and stopped. "Wrong with what?" he asked, tilting his head at an angle that hurt to look at. "Nothing," Sarah said quickly. "Just this place. We need to find a way out." We spent the day attempting increasingly desperate escape strategies. We tried following the creek both upstream and downstream. It led us in a perfect circle back to the clearing. We attempted to bushwhack through the undergrowth. Thorns that felt like broken glass and branches that seemed to actively grab at us. We even tried climbing trees to get a better view, but every tree we ascended showed us the same thing, an endless canopy stretching to the horizon with no breaks, no roads, no signs of civilization. As evening approached again, Sarah pulled me aside while Marcus was gathering firewood. "Something's wrong with him," she whispered urgently. "Really wrong. He's not moving right, not talking right. And did you see his reflection in the creek?" I had seen it, or rather, I'd seen the absence of it. Marcus's image in the water was faded, translucent, as if part of him wasn't entirely there anymore. "What do we do?" I asked. "I don't know, but we can't trust him. Whatever's in this forest, I think it's getting inside him." That night we took turns keeping watch. During Sarah's shift, around 3 a.m, Marcus left his tent and walked into the forest. I watched through my tent's mesh window as he moved between the trees with predatory grace, never stumbling despite the darkness. He returned an hour later carrying something in his hands, a bundle wrapped in what looked like his spare shirt. He placed it carefully beside the fire ring and went back to his tent as if nothing had happened. In the morning, the bundle was gone, but the smell remained, sweet and cloying, like meat left in the sun too long. "Where did you go last night?" Sarah asked Marcus over breakfast. "Nowhere," he said. but his smile never reached his eyes. Bad dreams kept me up. Thought I'd get some air. You were gone for an hour. Was I? He tilted his head again, and this time I heard his neck vertebrae pop with the motion. Time moves differently here. Haven't you noticed? He was right. The days felt both endless and compressed, as if hours were passing like minutes while minutes stretched into eternities. The sun's arc across the sky followed no pattern I could understand, sometimes appearing to reverse direction or jump suddenly from one position to another. That afternoon, while exploring yet another futile escape route, Sarah found the bones. They were arranged in a rough circle about a quarter-mile from our clearing, picked clean and bleached white despite what must have been their recent deposition. Deer bones mostly, but interspersed with pieces that were wrong, femurs too long, skulls with too many eye sockets, rib cages that spiraled impossibly. "We're leaving," Sarah announced when we returned to camp. "Right now. I don't care if we have to walk through the night." "But which direction?" Marcus asked reasonably. "Every way leads back here." "Then we'll keep trying until we find the right way." "Or," Marcus said, and his voice carried that echo again, "we could stop fighting it. This place wants us here. Maybe there's a reason." Sarah and I exchanged glances. His words were perfectly logical, but the tone was all wrong. Too calm, too accepting. The Marcus I knew would have been climbing the walls with anxiety by now. "What reason?" I asked carefully. "To feed," he said, and smiled with too many teeth. Sarah was on her feet instantly, backing away from the fire. "That's not Marcus." The thing wearing my friend's face laughed, a sound like wind through dead leaves. "Of course I'm Marcus. Who else would I be?" But even as it spoke, its features began to shift subtly. The face was still recognizably Marcus, but the proportions were wrong. Eyes too far apart, jaw too wide, skin pulled too tight over bone. When it stood, its limbs moved with joints that bent in directions human anatomy didn't allow. "Run," Sarah whispered. We bolted into the forest, crashing through undergrowth that tore at our clothes and skin. Behind us, the Marcus thing's laughter followed, echoing from every direction at once. The sound seemed to come from the trees themselves, from the ground beneath our feet, from the air we breathed. The forest became a maze of reaching branches and grasping thorns. No matter which direction we ran, the trees seemed to shift and close behind us, cutting off escape routes and funneling us deeper into the green darkness. Our headlamps carved weak cones of light that barely penetrated the shadows, and in their beams, shapes moved just at the edge of perception, tall, gaunt figures that dissolved when looked at directly. We ran for what felt like hours, but could have been minutes. Time had lost all meaning in this place where the laws of physics seemed to bend and break. Finally, exhausted and bleeding from dozens of scratches, we stumbled into another clearing. This one was different from our campsite. Ancient stones formed a rough circle in the center, carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The air here was thick and heavy, pressing down on us like a physical weight. And in the center of the stone circle sat Marcus. The real Marcus, I realized with a shock. He was bound to one of the stones with what looked like vines, but his eyes were alert and terrified. When he saw us, he tried to shout, but no sound emerged from his throat. "A trap," Sarah breathed. From the tree line around the clearing, figures began to emerge. They looked human at first glance, but the longer I stared, the more the wrongness became apparent. Their proportions were subtly off, like people stretched on a rack. Their movements were too fluid, too coordinated, as if choreographed by some alien intelligence. And their faces were masks of human features arranged in patterns that almost made sense but didn't quite. The Marcus thing we'd fled appeared among them, its disguise abandoned entirely now. What stood before us was tall and emaciated, with gray skin pulled tight over visible bones. Its eyes were black pits that seemed to drink in light, and when it opened its mouth I saw rows of teeth like broken glass. "You can't leave," it said in Marcus's voice, though its throat didn't move. No one leaves. This place is hungry, and it's been so long since it had fresh meat. The figures began to close in, moving with that same unnatural coordination. Their footsteps made no sound on the forest floor, and I realized they cast no shadows despite the moonlight streaming down through the canopy. "What are you?" Sarah whispered. "We are what remains," the thing that had been Marcus said. "What the forest creates from those who wander too far from the light. We were like you once, lost, afraid, desperate to escape, but the Wendigo found us, changed us, made us part of its hunger." The word sent ice through my veins. I'd heard the legends, stories passed down by the Penobscot and other tribes about the cannibalistic creature that stalked the northern forests. But this was worse than any legend. This was a corruption that spread like infection, turning its victims into extensions of its own twisted existence. "The hunger is everything," the creature continued, taking a step closer. "It fills the emptiness inside, gives purpose to existence. You'll understand soon." I looked around desperately for any means of escape, but we were surrounded. The stone circle seemed to be some kind of altar, stained dark with substances I didn't want to identify. And bound to the central stone, the real Marcus watched with desperate eyes, trying to warn us of something. Then I saw what he was looking at, a gap in the circle where one of the ancient stones had fallen. It was small, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through, but it faced away from most of our captors. "Sarah," I murmured, hoping she'd follow my gaze. She saw it too. Her hand found mine, squeezed once in understanding. The creatures were almost close enough to touch us now, their alien faces split by two wide grins. The smell of decay rose from them in waves, mixed with something else, the metallic scent of old blood and the sweet corruption of rotting meat. "When I say go," I whispered. The lead creature reached out with fingers that were too long, too jointed. Its touch would mean transformation, I knew, joining their ranks as another puppet of the Wendigo's hunger. "Go!" We sprinted toward the gap in the stones. The creatures reacted instantly, flowing after us with inhuman speed, but surprise gave us a crucial head start. I dove through the narrow opening, feeling rough stone scrape against my back, and rolled to my feet on the other side. Sarah was right behind me, but as she squeezed through the gap, one of the creatures grabbed her ankle. She screamed as its touch burned through her hiking boot, leaving blackened marks on her skin. I grabbed her hands and pulled, using every ounce of strength I had. For a moment, we were locked in a tug-of-war with the creature, its impossible strength nearly dragging her back. Then something gave way. Whether the boot or the creature's grip, I couldn't tell, and Sarah tumbled through the gap. We ran again, deeper into the forest. Behind us, the creature's howls of rage echoed through the trees, a sound like wind through a graveyard. But they didn't follow. Something about the stone circle kept them contained, at least temporarily. "We have to go back," Sarah gasped as we paused to catch our breath. "Marcus is still there." "Marcus is bait," I said grimly. "They're using him to draw us back. We can't just leave him. We can't save him if we're dead or transformed." But even as I said it, guilt gnawed at me. Marcus was my friend, had been my roommate for 3 years. The thought of abandoning him to those things made me sick. We found ourselves in yet another part of the forest that looked exactly like every other part. Endless trees stretching in all directions, thick undergrowth that caught at our legs, shadows that moved independent of any light source. But something was different here. The oppressive silence was broken by a sound I hadn't heard in days, the distant hum of an engine. "A road," Sarah breathed. "There's a road nearby." We followed the sound, pushing through thorns and brambles that seemed determined to keep us trapped. The engine noise grew louder, accompanied by the whisper of tires on asphalt. Civilization. Escape. The forest thinned, and through the trees, I could see a strip of blacktop. Route 11, according to a road sign partially hidden by overgrowth. A logging truck rumbled past, its headlights carving through the pre-dawn darkness. We emerged from the tree line like refugees from a war zone, stumbling onto the road surface with relief so intense it made my legs weak. The asphalt felt solid and real beneath my feet, anchored to the normal world. A pickup truck appeared around the curve, slowing when the driver spotted us. The window rolled down to reveal a weathered face beneath a John Deere cap. "You folks okay? Look like you've been through hell." "We got lost," I managed. "Been wandering for days. Our friend is still out there." The man's expression grew serious. "In the 100-mile wilderness? That's no place to get turned around. Hop in, I'll call the rangers." As we climbed into the truck's warm cab, I looked back at the forest. In the growing daylight, it looked perfectly normal. Just trees and undergrowth, nothing supernatural or threatening. But deep in the shadows between the trunks, I thought I saw movement. Tall, gaunt figures watching from the darkness. The search and rescue operation found no trace of Marcus. The Rangers covered hundreds of square miles over 3 days, using helicopters and tracking dogs, but it was as if he'd simply vanished. They found our original campsite eventually, but according to their GPS coordinates, it was 15 miles from where we insisted it should be. The mysterious stone circle didn't appear on any of their maps. "Sometimes the forest just takes people," one of the older rangers told me privately. "Been happening for generations. Native tribes used to say this land was cursed, that something hungry lived in the deep woods. Course, that's just superstition." But I saw the way he looked at the tree line when he thought no one was watching. Sarah and I gave our statements to the police, endured the skeptical looks when we described our experiences. Hallucinations brought on by exposure and stress, they decided. Hypothermia could cause all sorts of mental confusion. They didn't believe us about the creatures, about the forest that moved and changed, about Marcus being replaced by something else. How could they? We barely believed it ourselves in the harsh light of fluorescent interview rooms and hospital waiting areas. The doctors treated Sarah's ankle where the creature had grabbed her. The burns were unlike anything they'd seen, circular marks that went deep into the tissue, forming patterns that almost resembled symbols. They scarred badly despite the best medical care, leaving permanent reminders of what we'd encountered. I returned to my accounting job, tried to slip back into the routine of spreadsheets and tax returns, but the fluorescent lights reminded me of moonlight through dead trees, and the office's white noise systems couldn't drown out the memory of whispered conversations in empty air. Sarah quit her job and moved across the country, as far from Maine's forests as she could get. She sends me emails sometimes, short messages that never directly mention what happened but carry the weight of shared trauma. She's seeing a therapist, she says, trying to sleep through the night without dreams of things with too many teeth. The official report blamed Marcus's disappearance on a hiking accident, probable fall into a ravine or drowning in one of the area's many streams. His body was never recovered. The case remains open, but inactive. I know better. Marcus is still out there, in that place between spaces where the forest bends reality like heated plastic. He's part of the hunger now, another puppet in the Wendigo's collection. Sometimes, on particularly dark nights, I think I hear him calling my name from the shadows outside my apartment window. The doctors say my leg will never fully heal. The muscle damage from our desperate flight through the undergrowth left me with a permanent limp, a constant reminder of our escape. But I consider it a small price to pay. We made it out, Sarah and I. We survived. Most people don't. I've done research since then, diving deep into local folklore and historical records. The disappearances go back centuries. Native American legends, colonial-era accounts, modern missing persons reports. Always the same pattern. People venture into the deep wilderness and simply vanish, sometimes leaving behind camps that show signs of something wrong, sometimes disappearing without a trace. The Penobscot have a name for that part of the forest, Kche Manto's hunting ground, the great spirit's shadow, where the line between the living world and the spirit realm grows thin. They avoid it, have always avoided it, but white settlers pushed into every corner of the wilderness, mapping and naming and claiming territory that was never meant for human occupation. Some places are hungry. Some places remember the taste of blood and want more. I don't go camping anymore. The sight of trees pressing close together makes my chest tight with claustrophobia, and the sound of wind in the branches sounds too much like whispered conversations. My friends think I've developed some kind of phobia trauma response from losing Marcus. They're not entirely wrong, but sometimes, late at night when the city sleeps and shadows pool deep in alleyways, I remember the taste of that forest air, sweet with decay, thick with promises of transformation. Part of me understands the hunger now, recognizes the seductive pull of letting go, of becoming something else entirely. The Wendigo is patient. It's been waiting in those woods for longer than human memory, feeding on the lost and the desperate, and it knows that some of us who escape never really leave. We carry a piece of it with us, a seed of its hunger that grows a little larger each day. My name is David Jones, and I am 28 years old. I escaped from something in the Maine wilderness that shouldn't exist, but I'm starting to understand that escape is a relative term. The hunger is still there, whispering at the edges of my thoughts. And one day, when the weight of normal life becomes too much to bear, I know I'll return to those forests. The Wendigo is patient, but it never forgets. Some hunts last a lifetime. The second day brought our first real technological problems, though calling them problems seems inadequate for what were clearly supernatural manifestations. My GPS unit, a high-end device that had never failed me in 5 years of wilderness travel, began showing our location as somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The coordinates kept shifting randomly, sometimes placing us in Canada, sometimes in Mexico, sometimes showing no signal at all despite the clear sky above. "That's impossible," I said, tapping the screen. "This thing has never malfunctioned before." David's compass was behaving even more strangely. The needle spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north, sometimes pointing in completely different directions within seconds. He held it level, checked for metal interference, even tried a backup compass from his pack. Same result. "Technology fails in the wilderness," David said, but I caught the tremor in his voice. His hands were shaking as he stared at the spinning needle. "Good thing I know how to navigate by landmarks." Except the landmarks weren't where they should be. The trail markers that had been clear the day before seemed to have moved overnight. Blazes that should have been on the right side of trees appeared on the left. The trail itself seemed to fork and divide in ways that weren't marked on any map, branching off into paths that couldn't possibly exist. According to our topographical maps, we should have been following the ridgeline of Chairback Mountain, with the trail clearly marked and well-maintained. Instead, we found ourselves in a maze of animal paths and deer trails that led in seemingly random directions. The forest had taken on an alien quality, as if we'd somehow been transported to a different world entirely. "This doesn't make sense," I said, studying the map for the 10th time. "We should have crossed Chairback Stream 2 hours ago. The trail should be obvious." The trees themselves seemed wrong. Ancient spruces and firs that had stood for centuries appeared to have moved during the night, creating new corridors and blocking familiar paths. Moss grew in patterns that defied nature, forming spirals and symbols that hurt to look at directly. And everywhere there were signs of something moving through the forest. Broken branches, disturbed undergrowth, and most disturbing of all, tracks. David was examining a tree that bore fresh scratches in the bark when I found him standing motionless, staring at the gouges with an expression of pure terror. The scratches were long, parallel gouges that went too deep to be from any normal animal. They were at least 8 feet off the ground and cut clean through to the heartwood, as if whatever had made them possessed claws like railroad spikes. "Mike, look at this," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The scratches weren't random. They formed a deliberate pattern. 5 parallel lines, then 3, then 5 again. And beneath them, Carved into the bark with surgical precision were symbols that belonged to no alphabet I'd ever seen. They looked ancient, predatory, hungry. Bear, I suggested, though I knew it wasn't. The largest black bear in Maine couldn't have reached that high, and the precision of the marks ruled out any natural explanation. Bears don't climb that high just to scratch trees, and they don't make marks this precise. He traced one of the gouges with his finger, and I noticed that his hand was trembling. These are almost deliberate, like symbols, like it was trying to communicate something. Around the base of the tree, the ground was disturbed in a perfect circle, as if something had been dancing or performing some kind of ritual. The earth was black and oily, with an organic smell that made my name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the 100-mile wilderness of Maine, just north of Baxter State Park, in an area so remote that cell towers are just a memory, and the nearest road is a 40-mile hike through terrain that has claimed more lives than the state wants to admit. David Jones and I had been planning this trip for months. We'd met in college during our sophomore year when we were both assigned to the same dorm room, a pairing that started with mutual annoyance over his obsessive organization and my creative chaos, but evolved into a brotherhood that survived everything from failed exams to broken hearts. David was the methodical one, the planner who researched every trail marker and weather pattern before we set foot outside. I was the dreamer, always pushing for more challenging routes, more remote destinations, more adventure than common sense would dictate. After graduation, we'd gone our separate ways. Him to Boston for his finance job at a prestigious investment firm. Me to Portland, where I struggled to build my graphic design business. But every year, without fail, we'd meet up for a wilderness adventure that became our anchor point, the one constant in our increasingly complicated adult lives. We'd hiked sections of the Pacific Crest Trail, explored the backcountry of Yellowstone, and conquered peaks in the White Mountains. Each trip was a chance to strip away the pretenses of our professional lives and remember who we really were beneath the suits and deadlines. This year, David had suggested something different. The 100-mile wilderness, he'd said during our planning call in August, his voice carrying an excitement I hadn't heard in years. It's the most challenging section of the Appalachian Trail in Maine. Completely isolated. No roads, no resupply points, no cell service, just us and 100 miles of pure wilderness. I should have paid more attention to why he was so insistent on this particular destination. David had always been drawn to challenges, but there was something almost desperate in his enthusiasm for this trip. Looking back, I wonder if he'd already been feeling the pull of that cursed place, if something in that wilderness had been calling to him long before we ever set foot on the trail. The 100-mile wilderness stretches from Monson to the base of Mount Katahdin, through terrain so rugged and remote that the Appalachian Trail Conservancy requires hikers to carry 10 days of supplies. It's a landscape unchanged since the last ice age, dense forests of spruce and fir, pristine lakes that have never known the sound of a motor, and mountains that rise like ancient sentinels above valleys where no human foot has ever stepped. David was always the more experienced outdoorsman. At 29, he'd climbed mountains across 3 continents and had an almost supernatural ability to navigate by stars alone. He could read weather patterns in cloud formations, predict animal behavior from subtle signs most people would never notice, and find water sources in the driest terrain. His pack was always precisely organized, every item serving multiple purposes, every gram of weight calculated and justified. I trusted him implicitly, which is why I ignored the first signs that something was wrong. We'd started our hike on a crisp October morning from Monson, the last resupply town before the wilderness. The small logging town sat at the edge of civilization like a final warning, its weathered buildings and quiet streets speaking of isolation and hardship. The local outfitter, a grizzled man named Frank who'd been serving hikers for 40 years, had looked at us with an expression that made my skin crawl. "You boys sure about this?" he'd asked, studying our permits. "Weather's been strange lately. Storms coming out of nowhere, temperatures dropping when they shouldn't. Had 3 groups turn back just last week." David had dismissed his concerns with a confidence that now seems tragically naive. "We've done harder trails than this. We'll be fine." But Frank had continued to stare at us with those haunted eyes. "It's not the trail I'm worried about. It's what's been happening out there. Animals acting wrong, sounds that don't belong. Park Service won't admit it, but there've been incidents." The autumn colors were at their peak. Maples blazing scarlet like spilled blood, birches glowing gold in the slanted morning light, and oaks deep amber like old whiskey. The beauty was almost overwhelming, a last gift before the forest revealed its true nature. But there was something else in the air, something that made the hair on my arms stand up despite the perfect weather. A charge, like the moment before lightning strikes, and a smell underneath the crisp autumn air. Something organic and wrong, like meat left too long in the sun. Even the wildlife seemed affected. Squirrels chattered nervously from the trees, their calls sharp and agitated. Birds flew in confused patterns, sometimes crashing into branches as if they'd forgotten how to navigate. And everywhere there was silence where there should have been sound. No insects buzzing, no small animals rustling through the undergrowth, just an oppressive quiet that seemed to swallow noise before it could travel more than a few feet. "Feel that?" David asked as we crossed the Penobscot River on the second day. We'd spent our first night at Shaw's boarding house in Monson, a traditional last stop for northbound hikers, but neither of us had slept well. The dreams had been strange. Visions of endless forests where the trees moved when you weren't looking directly at them, and voices calling from distances that seemed both impossibly far and uncomfortably close. "Feel what?" I asked, though I knew exactly what he meant. The sensation had been growing stronger since we'd entered the wilderness proper. It felt like being watched by something with infinite patience, something that had all the time in the world to study us and plan. He paused on the rustic wooden bridge, his gray eyes scanning the tree line with an intensity that worried me. The Penobscot flowed beneath us, dark water carrying fallen leaves toward the distant ocean, but even the sound of the current seemed muted, as if the forest was absorbing everything: light, sound, even hope itself. "Like we're being watched," he said finally, "like we're not alone out here." I laughed it off, but the sound came out forced and hollow. Probably just a moose. They're all over this area. Or maybe a black bear getting ready for winter. But David didn't laugh. He kept staring into the forest with an expression I'd never seen before. Not fear, exactly, but a deep unease that seemed to settle into his bones. His hands were trembling slightly as he gripped his trekking poles, and I noticed a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the cool air. "Dave, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," he muttered, so quietly I almost didn't catch it. The forest on the far side of the river was different from what we'd hiked through the day before. The trees were older here, their trunks massive and gnarled, their branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy so thick that midday felt like dusk. Moss hung from the limbs like tattered curtains, and the undergrowth was so dense it seemed impenetrable. But it was the silence that was most unsettling, a complete absence of the normal sounds of a healthy forest. "When's the last time you heard a bird?" I asked as we resumed hiking. David stopped so abruptly I nearly walked into him. "What did you say?" "Just asking about birds. Haven't heard any since yesterday afternoon." His face had gone pale. "Yesterday afternoon, right around the time we—" He cut himself off, shaking his head. "Never mind. Let's keep moving." But I could see the wheels turning in his head, the way they did when he was trying to solve a problem at work. David was the kind of person who needed everything to make sense, who looked for patterns and logical explanations even when the universe refused to provide them. The first night we camped at a designated site near Cloud Pond, though designated was a generous term for what amounted to a small clearing with a fire ring built from local stones. The site was supposed to be scenic. Cloud Pond was known for its pristine beauty and perfect reflections of the surrounding peaks. But as we set up our tents in the fading light, the water looked black and still, like a mirror made of obsidian. The silence was absolute in a way that city dwellers never experience. No traffic, no sirens, no hum of electricity, just the occasional crack of a twig or rustle of leaves. But even those sounds seemed wrong, too loud and sharp in the oppressive quiet. We built our fire carefully, following leave-no-trace principles, gathering only dead and downed wood, keeping the flames small and contained. The fire seemed reluctant to catch, the wood smoking and smoldering despite being completely dry. Our dinner was the usual backpacker fare, dehydrated beef stroganoff that tasted like salted cardboard and required creative imagination to identify as food. But neither of us had much appetite. The forest around us felt watchful, expectant, like a theater audience waiting for the curtain to rise. "Mike," David said, poking at the fire with a stick. His voice was hushed, almost reverent, as if speaking too loudly might wake something better left sleeping. "You ever hear of the Wendigo?" "The what?" "Native American legend. Algonquian tribes, the Ojibwe, Cree, Innu. They used to tell stories about it." He stared into the flames as he spoke, his face taking on the expression of someone recounting a half-remembered nightmare. "A cannibalistic creature that was once human, but got transformed after resorting to eating human flesh during starvation. They say it's always hungry, never satisfied, driven by an endless need to consume." The fire popped and crackled, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness where they were quickly swallowed by the night. "Jesus, Dave, planning to keep me up all night with ghost stories?" But he continued, as if he hadn't heard me. "The transformation isn't just physical. The Wendigo becomes something else entirely, taller than any human, with yellowed fangs and eyes like holes burned into paper. Its skin becomes tight and gray, stretched over bones that have grown too large for any earthly creature. But the worst part is that it retains the memories and personality of the person it used to be. It can speak, reason, manipulate. It knows exactly how to exploit human weakness." "Where the hell did you learn all this?" He shrugged, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. "Research. After I decided on this trip, I started reading about the history of this area. Just something an old Penobscot guide told a researcher once. Said this whole section of wilderness was considered cursed by his people. That's why it was never settled, even back in the 1800s when land was cheap and settlers were desperate." "And you thought this would be a fun story to share while we're camping alone in the middle of nowhere?" David looked up at me then, and in the firelight his eyes seemed to reflect the flames like an animal's. "The guide said the Wendigo can take on the appearance of people it's consumed. Use their memories, their voices, their mannerisms. The perfect predator because it always looks like someone you trust." I was about to respond with some joke about David watching too many horror movies when our fire suddenly dimmed, the flames turning from orange to an eerie blue-green color that cast sickly shadows across our campsite. We both stared at it, transfixed by the impossible sight. The blue flames danced and writhed like living things, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw shapes moving within them, human silhouettes twisted into impossible positions. "Copper," David said finally, but his voice was barely a whisper. "Must be copper in the wood." But his explanation carried no conviction, and the fire returned to normal orange within seconds, leaving us both wondering if we'd imagined the entire episode. The incident should have been easily dismissed as a trick of the light or an unusual mineral content in the wood, but it left us both shaken in a way that neither of us wanted to acknowledge. We turned in early, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to sounds I couldn't identify. Not quite animal, not quite wind. Scratching sounds that seemed to circle our camp in deliberate patterns. Soft footfalls that would stop whenever I held my breath to listen more carefully. At one point, I could have sworn I heard breathing just outside my tent, slow and deliberate, as if something was standing there studying me through the thin nylon wall. The sounds were accompanied by smells that had no place in a pristine wilderness. The stench of rotting meat, the sweet, sick smell of infection, and underneath it all, something chemical and wrong that made my eyes water and my stomach churn. When I finally worked up the courage to unzip my tent flap to look outside, there was nothing but darkness so complete it seemed solid. My headlamp beam penetrated only a few feet before being swallowed entirely, as if the night itself was consuming light. But in that brief moment before I zipped the tent closed again, I thought I saw something moving just beyond the edge of my vision, a pale shape that might have been human or might have been something else entirely. The second day brought our first real problem. My GPS unit, which had been working perfectly, began showing our location as somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. David's compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. "Technology fails," David said, but I caught the tremor in his voice. "Good thing I know how to navigate by landmarks." Except the landmarks weren't where they should be. The trail markers that had been clear the day before seemed to have moved. Blazes that should have been on the right side of trees appeared on the left. The trail itself seemed to fork and divide in ways that weren't marked on any map. By afternoon, we admitted we were lost. "This doesn't make sense," I said, studying the topographical map. "We should have crossed Chairback Stream 2 hours ago." David was examining a tree that bore fresh scratches in the bark, long, parallel gouges that went too deep to be from any normal animal. "Mike, look at this." The scratches were at least 8 feet off the ground and cut clean through to the heartwood. Whatever had made them had claws like railroad spikes. "Bear?" I suggested, though I knew it wasn't. "Bears don't climb that high just to scratch trees, and they don't make marks this precise." He traced one of the gouges with his finger. "These are almost deliberate, like symbols." As the sun began to set, we made the decision to camp early rather than continue wandering in circles. We found a small clearing beside what we hoped was the trail, though by this point I wasn't sure anything we were following was actually a trail. That's when we discovered our supplies had begun to rot. The bread that had been fresh that morning was covered in a green-black mold that stank of decay. Our apples had turned brown and soft, oozing a dark liquid that stained everything it touched. Even our dried goods, rice, pasta, energy bars, had somehow become infested with insects that looked like nothing I'd ever seen before. They had too many legs and moved in a way that defied natural law, skittering in perfect synchronization. "This is impossible," I said, holding up a package of trail mix that now writhed with the strange insects. "This stuff was sealed. It was fine this morning." David said nothing. He was staring at his hands, which were shaking. We managed to salvage enough food for a meager dinner, though neither of us had much appetite. The forest around us had fallen into a silence so complete it felt oppressive. No owl calls, no rustle of small animals, not even the sound of wind through the trees. "I'm going to gather more firewood," David announced as darkness fell. "We'll need a big fire tonight." Something in his tone alarmed me. "I'll come with you." "No." His voice was sharp, almost aggressive. "Stay here. Keep the fire going. I'll be back in 20 minutes. He disappeared into the darkness before I could protest. 20 minutes passed, then 40, then an hour. I called his name until my throat was raw, but the forest swallowed my voice like it was nothing. The fire began to die down despite my constant feeding of it, and no matter how much wood I added, the flames stayed low and weak, casting barely enough light to see my own hands. That's when I heard footsteps approaching through the trees. "Dave," I called. Thank God, I was starting to worry. The footsteps stopped just outside the circle of firelight. "Dave!" A figure stepped into view, and my relief turned to ice-cold terror. It was David, same height, same build, same brown hair and hiking clothes, but something was fundamentally wrong. His face was too pale, his eyes too bright, and his smile stretched too wide, showing teeth that seemed sharper than they should be. "Sorry I was gone so long, Mike," he said, and his voice was David's voice, but somehow hollow, like an echo of itself. "Got turned around in the dark." He sat down across the fire from me, still wearing that unsettling smile. "Where's the firewood?" I asked. He looked at his empty hands as if noticing them for the first time. "Oh, must have dropped it." We sat in silence for several minutes. This thing that looked like David never stopped staring at me, never blinked, never stopped smiling. And slowly, I began to notice other details that were wrong. His breathing was too shallow, almost non-existent. When he shifted position, he moved with a fluid grace that David had never possessed. And his eyes, David's eyes had always been gray, but these were completely black, like pools of oil. "You seem tense, Mike," Not David said. "Something wrong?" "Just tired," I managed. "We should get some sleep. Big day tomorrow." But I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel that thing watching me from across the dying fire. Around midnight, I heard it moving around the camp with sounds that were almost footsteps but not quite. When I peeked out of my tent, I saw it crouched over our remaining food supplies, doing something I couldn't quite make out in the darkness. In the morning, everything edible had been reduced to a gray, slimy mass that stank of corruption. "That's weird," Not David said with that same horrible smile. "Must be some kind of bacteria in the air here." We hiked in silence that day. The thing wearing David's face led the way with a confidence that should have been reassuring, but instead filled me with dread. It never consulted the map, never checked the compass, just walked with the sure-footed gait of something that knew exactly where it was going. The landscape around us had changed too. The trees seemed taller, their branches reaching down like grasping fingers. The trail, if it could still be called that, wound through formations of rock that jutted from the earth like broken teeth, and everywhere there were more of those deep scratches in the trees, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. "Dave," I said finally, "we need to talk about what happened last night." It turned to look at me, head swiveling with an unnatural smoothness. "What about it?" "You were gone for over an hour. Where did you go?" "Told you, got turned around. And you didn't bring back any firewood." "Dropped it. And our food. These things happen in the wilderness, Mike." Its voice had taken on an edge that made my skin crawl. "You know that." But David would never have dismissed the mysterious corruption of our supplies so casually. David was methodical, scientific. He would have had theories, explanations, something other than this blank acceptance of the impossible. As the day wore on, I began to notice that we were walking in circles. The same distinctive boulder, the same fallen tree, the same cluster of white birches passed by us again and again. When I pointed this out, Not David just smiled that terrible smile and said, "All wilderness looks the same after a while." That night, as we made camp in what I was beginning to realize was the exact same clearing we'd used the night before, I made my decision. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't David, and I had to get away from it. I waited until Not David's breathing became regular, then carefully extracted myself from my sleeping bag. My plan was simple: grab my pack and run. I didn't care about the trail or navigation or any of it. I just needed to get as far away as possible from the thing that was wearing my best friend's face. I was halfway to my pack when it spoke. "Going somewhere, Mike?" I turned. It was sitting up in its sleeping bag, head tilted at an impossible angle, those black eyes reflecting the last embers of our fire like a cat's. I need to pee." It smiled. "No, you don't." The pretense fell away then. We stared at each other in the flickering firelight, predator and prey, and I saw something move beneath its skin, rippling like water. "What are you?" I whispered. "I'm David," it said, and laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Or I will be, once I've had enough time to perfect the impression. You humans are so complicated, so many little mannerisms to master." It stood up, and I realized it was taller than David had been. Much taller. Its limbs stretched and elongated as I watched, joints bending in directions that defied anatomy. "Where is he?" I demanded. "Where's David?" "Oh, he's still here." It tapped its chest with fingers that were now too long, ending in claws. "Right here with me. Would you like to speak with him?" Its face contorted, features shifting like clay, and for a horrible moment I saw David's real face looking out at me, eyes wide with terror, mouth moving in a soundless scream. Then the thing's true face reasserted itself, and I saw what it really was. Gaunt beyond description, with yellow eyes and a mouth full of needle teeth. Its skin was the color of old parchment and stretched tight over bones that seemed too large for any earthly creature. "Wendigo," I breathed. "Very good. Your friend taught me that word, along with so many other things." It took a step toward me, and I could smell its breath, the stench of rotting meat and something else, something primal and wrong. "He's been most educational. Did you know that fear has a flavor? It tastes like copper and Christmas morning." I ran. Behind me, I heard it laugh again, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then I heard it moving through the forest, but not like any animal I'd ever encountered. It moved like wind through the trees, like shadow-given substance. I crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and face. My headlamp cast a weak cone of light that seemed to make the darkness beyond even more oppressive. Behind me, I could hear it calling to me in David's voice. "Mike! Mike! Where are you? I'm hurt. I need help." I knew it was a lie, but the voice was so perfectly David's that for a moment I almost turned back. The pursuit continued for hours. Every time I thought I'd lost it, I would hear that voice calling from a different direction, sometimes pleading, sometimes angry, sometimes laughing. The forest itself seemed to be working against me, branches grabbing at my clothes, roots rising to trip me, the ground becoming soft and marshy without warning. Dawn found me collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath and bleeding from dozens of cuts. The forest around me was completely unfamiliar, but at least the terrible presence seemed to have retreated with the coming of light. That's when I saw the ranger station. It was small and weathered, tucked into a grove of ancient pines, but it was the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen. I stumbled toward it, nearly weeping with relief. The ranger was a grizzled man in his 60s with kind eyes and hands that had seen decades of outdoor work. His name tag read Malcolm Crow. "You look like hell, son," he said, helping me to a chair. "What happened to you?" I tried to explain, but the words came out in a jumbled rush. Lost friend, thing in the woods, not really David, Wendigo. I sounded insane even to myself. Malcolm listened without interruption, occasionally nodding. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "This friend of yours," he said finally. "What did he look like?" I described David as best I could. Malcolm's expression grew increasingly grim. "Brown hair, gray eyes, about 6 feet tall." "Yes, that's him." Malcolm walked to a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder. Inside were photographs and missing person reports. "David Jones," he read from one of the reports, age 29, from Boston. Reported missing 3 weeks ago by his hiking partner after they were separated during a storm. My blood turned to ice. 3 weeks? But that's impossible. We just started hiking 2 days ago. "Son," Malcolm said gently, "today is November 15th. You've been missing for 3 weeks. The world seemed to tilt around me. 3 weeks? I'd lost 3 weeks of my life in that forest, living the same nightmare loop over and over while that thing learned to wear David's face. "There's more," Malcolm continued. "Your friend David, we found his remains yesterday, what was left of them, about 2 miles from where you came out of the woods." He showed me crime scene photos that I immediately wished I could unsee. The bones had been cracked open, the marrow sucked out. There were signs of consumption. "Local Penobscot tribal elders call it a Wendigo," Malcolm said. "Something that was once human but gave in to cannibalism. They say it can take the form of its victims, use their memories and personalities to lure in new prey." I thought about the thing that had worn David's face, how it had gradually become more perfect in its imitation, how it had been learning from him. It let me go, I realized. It could have caught me any time during that chase, but it let me go. Malcolm nodded grimly. They do that sometimes. Let one survive to spread the story, to make others come looking. creates more opportunities. I spent 2 days in the hospital in Bangor, being treated for exposure and malnutrition. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive, that I showed signs of severe dehydration and starvation despite my insistence that I'd only been in the woods for 2 days. The official report listed David as a victim of animal attack, probably a bear. They warned hikers to be extra cautious in that area, but they didn't close it. They never do. I know better now. I know what's really out there in the 100-mile wilderness, wearing the faces of the lost and calling to the living with voices of the dead. I know that David is still there in some form, trapped inside that thing, aware and suffering. Sometimes, late at night, I get calls on my phone. The number is always blocked, but I recognize the voice. Mike, it says in David's voice, but wrong, like a recording played at the wrong speed. Mike, why did you leave me? I'm still here. I'm still waiting. I've changed my number 6 times now. It doesn't matter. Last week, I saw a news report about 2 hikers who had gone missing in the same area. College friends, they said. One named Sarah and one named Emily. They showed photos of them smiling at the camera, arms around each other's shoulders. I wanted to call the ranger station, to warn them, but what would I say? That there's a monster in the woods that steals faces and voices? That it's getting better at what it does? More patient? More cunning? Instead, I find myself packing my hiking gear again, loading my GPS with the coordinates of the 100-mile wilderness, because somewhere in that cursed forest my best friend is trapped inside something unspeakable, and those 2 missing hikers are probably experiencing their own private hell right now. I know it's what the Wendigo wants. I know I'm walking into a trap. But I can't abandon David, not again. And maybe, if I'm clever enough, fast enough, lucky enough, I can put an end to this thing before it claims anyone else. The Wendigo is learning, evolving, becoming more perfect in its deceptions. But it made one mistake when it let me live. It gave me time to learn too. I leave for Maine tomorrow morning. If you're reading this and I don't come back, stay away from the 100-mile wilderness. Don't trust the voices in the dark, no matter how familiar they sound. And if you see someone who looks like me walking out of those woods, someone who claims to be Michael Williams but seems just a little bit off, just a little bit wrong, don't believe them, because it won't be me. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the Allagash Wilderness Waterway, deep in the heart of northern Maine, during what was supposed to be the best week of our lives. The 5 of us had been planning this trip for months. Jake Morrison, my college roommate and eternal optimist, had convinced our group that we needed to disconnect from the digital world and reconnect with our primal selves. His words, not mine. Jake was the kind of guy who unironically used phrases like that, but somehow made them sound reasonable. Sarah Chen, our resident outdoors expert and the only one among us with actual wilderness experience, had mapped out our route through the remote waterway system. Tom Bradley, quiet and methodical, had handled all the gear procurement with his typical obsessive attention to detail. And then there was Danny Kowalski, whose primary contribution was an endless supply of inappropriate jokes and a cooler full of beer that Sarah had reluctantly allowed him to bring. Me? I was just along for the ride, hoping a week in the wilderness might help me forget about the divorce papers sitting on my kitchen table back in Portland. We launched our canoes from the Allagash Lake access point on a crisp October morning, the kind where your breath fogs in the air and the lake surface looks like black glass. The autumn foliage was at its peak, brilliant reds and golds that seemed almost artificial in their intensity. Sarah had chosen this route specifically because it would take us deep into the wilderness, far from any roads or cell towers, following the ancient waterways that had been used by Native Americans for thousands of years. "Last chance for civilization, boys," Danny called out as he fumbled with his paddle, nearly capsizing his canoe in the process. "Next stop, the Stone Age." Tom, sharing a canoe with Danny, gripped the sides with white knuckles. "Try not to drown us before we even start, you idiot." Sarah and Jake had paired up in the lead canoe, leaving me to paddle solo in the smaller craft we'd rented. I didn't mind the solitude. It gave me space to think, or more accurately, to try not to think about Lisa and the way she'd looked at me when she'd said we were fundamentally incompatible as life partners. Even her breakup speech had sounded like corporate jargon. The first day passed without incident. We made good time down Allagash Lake, then portaged around a beaver dam before setting up camp on a small island near the mouth of Allagash Stream. The isolation was already noticeable. Not a single contrail in the sky, no distant hum of traffic, just the whisper of wind through pine needles and the occasional call of a loon. Sarah had us set up camp in a tight cluster, our tents forming a rough semicircle around the fire pit. Basic wilderness safety, she explained, checking her GPS device one last time before the batteries died. Stay together, especially at night. The Allagash has a reputation for getting people turned around. What kind of reputation? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. People go missing, she said matter-of-factly as if discussing the weather. Usually inexperienced hikers who wander off trails, but even experienced guides have had close calls. The Micmac called this area Allagash, Bark Cabin, but they also had another name for it, Chenoo Territory. Chenoo? Jake looked up from where he was struggling to get his sleeping bag into his tent. Think Wendigo, but worse. Cannibalistic ice giants with an insatiable hunger for human flesh. According to legend, they can possess people, turning them into creatures like themselves. Sarah's tone was casual, but I caught her glancing toward the tree line as she spoke. Just folklore, of course, but folklore usually has roots in reality. This country can change a person if they're not careful. Danny laughed, but it sounded forced. Great bedtime story, Sarah. Really sets the mood for a relaxing camping trip. That first night, I dreamed of ice and hunger. I woke around 3 a.m. with my heart pounding, unable to shake the sensation that something had been breathing on my face. When I unzipped my tent flap to check, the forest was dead silent. Not even the rustle of small animals or the distant hoot of an owl. Just oppressive, unnatural silence that made my skin crawl. The second day started wrong. Tom's coffee percolator, which had worked perfectly the night before, refused to light. The propane connection seemed fine, but the flame would sputter and die every time he tried to start it. More concerning was Jake's GPS unit, which had been working fine when we'd stopped for lunch but now showed our location as somewhere in the middle of Hudson Bay. Technology, Danny said with forced cheerfulness. Can't trust it. Good thing we've got Sarah's paper maps. But when Sarah spread out her topographical map, the confusion deepened. According to her compass, we were heading northwest, which should have taken us down Allagash Stream toward Round Pond. The map clearly showed the route, but the landscape around us didn't match. The stream we'd been following had widened into something that looked more like a small lake, surrounded by dense forest that seemed far older and wilder than what we'd seen yesterday. Maybe we took a wrong turn at that last confluence, Sarah muttered, but her confidence was shaken. I'd never seen her look uncertain about anything outdoors related. Or maybe the map's wrong, I suggested, though that seemed unlikely given Sarah's meticulous preparation. We decided to press on, hoping to reach a recognizable landmark. But as the day wore on, the wrongness became harder to ignore. The trees seemed larger, their branches intertwining overhead to create a canopy so thick that even midday felt like twilight. The water beneath our canoes had turned an unsettling dark green, and despite the October chill, it gave off a faintly sweet, rotting smell. Worse than the environmental changes was what was happening to my friends. Jake, usually the most talkative person in any group, had become increasingly quiet, responding to questions with grunts or single-word answers. Tom had developed a nervous tic, constantly checking and rechecking his gear with an obsessive intensity that went beyond his usual thoroughness. Danny's jokes had become darker, with an edge of genuine malice that made us all uncomfortable. Only Sarah seemed unaffected, but I caught her checking her compass more and more frequently, her frown deepening each time. We made camp that evening on a small spit of land that jutted into what Sarah's map insisted should be Round Pond, but which looked nothing like the clear, circular body of water described in the guidebooks. This water was kidney-shaped and dark as coffee, surrounded by what looked like a grove of trees that had been deliberately arranged in concentric circles. "This place gives me the creeps," Tom said as he set up his tent with mechanical precision, checking each stake 3 times before moving to the next. "It's just the isolation getting to you," Sarah replied, but she kept glancing toward the tree line. "A lot of people experience anxiety when they're this far from civilization. It's a normal psychological response." That night, the fire wouldn't stay lit. We'd built it properly. Sarah had supervised every step, using dry tinder and well-seasoned wood. But every time we got a decent blaze going, it would suddenly dim to coals, as if something was sucking the oxygen away. Even more disturbing, when it did flicker back to life, the flames occasionally turned an unsettling blue-green color that cast everything in a sickly, otherworldly light. Danny disappeared around 10 p.m. He'd gone to gather more firewood, carrying Tom's hatchet and a flashlight. When he didn't return after an hour, we organized a search. Sarah insisted we stay together, so we moved through the forest as a group, calling his name. The beam of my flashlight seemed somehow weaker than it should be, the darkness pressing in around us like a living thing. The forest had that same unnatural silence from the night before, but now it felt actively hostile, as if something was watching us from just beyond our circle of light. We found Danny's flashlight first, lying at the base of a massive pine tree about 50 yards from camp. The light was still on, but the beam was dim and yellow, as if the batteries were dying despite being fresh. There was no sign of struggle, no broken branches or disturbed undergrowth. The hatchet was nowhere to be found. "Danny!" Jake called, his voice cracking with strain. "Danny, where are you?" A sound drifted through the trees, faint but unmistakably human. It might have been laughter or sobbing. It was impossible to tell which. "We need to go back to camp," Sarah said firmly. "Mark our perimeter with the remaining flashlights, keep the fire going, and wait for daylight. If he's lost, he'll find his way back to the light." "We can't just abandon him," I protested. "We're not abandoning him. We're being smart. Getting lost ourselves won't help him, and in this terrain, at night, that's exactly what will happen." She was right, but it felt like cowardice. We returned to camp and spent the longest night of my life feeding wood to a fire that seemed determined to die, jumping at every sound from the forest. Tom had stopped talking entirely, just sat staring into the flames with glassy eyes. Jake paced the perimeter of our camp like a caged animal, muttering to himself. Around 3 a.m., we heard footsteps approaching through the trees. "Danny?" Sarah called softly. The footsteps paused, then continued. A figure emerged from the tree line, moving with a strange, too fluid gait. It was Danny, but something was wrong. His clothes were torn and dirty, streaked with what looked like dark mud or dried blood, but it was his face that made my stomach drop. His expression was completely blank, eyes reflecting the firelight like an animal's, and he was smiling, a wide, empty smile that never wavered. "Where have you been?" Jake demanded, rushing toward him. "We've been worried sick." Danny turned toward Jake's voice, but his eyes didn't focus properly. When he spoke, his voice was oddly flat, as if he was reading from a script. "I got lost. I'm back now." "Are you hurt?" Sarah moved closer, her voice careful and controlled. "There's blood on your shirt." Danny looked down at himself with mild interest, as if noticing the stains for the first time. "I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. Even in the flickering firelight, I could see that the proportions of his face were slightly wrong, as if someone had tried to reconstruct him from memory. His smile was too wide, stretching past where it should naturally end. And his eyes. His eyes were completely black, no whites visible at all. "Danny," I said carefully, "what happened to the hatchet?" He tilted his head, the motion too quick and bird-like to be natural. "What hatchet?" Tom let out a strangled whimper and scrambled backward, nearly falling into the fire. "The hatchet you took to cut firewood," Sarah said, her hand moving slowly toward the knife on her belt. Danny's smile widened further, revealing teeth that looked somehow sharper than they should be. I don't remember a hatchet. The thing that looked like Danny sat down beside the fire with fluid, boneless grace, never breaking eye contact with any of us. For the rest of the night, it sat motionless, that terrible smile never wavering, watching us with predatory patience. None of us slept. When dawn finally broke, revealing a gray, overcast sky that looked nothing like the clear weather forecast we'd checked before leaving, the Danny thing was gone. There was no trace it had ever been there. No footprints, no impression in the ground where it had sat. Even the torn, blood-stained clothes we'd seen were nowhere to be found. "We need to leave," Sarah said. Her composure was finally cracking, fear bleeding through her carefully maintained control. "Something is very wrong here. We need to get back to civilization immediately." But when we tried to break camp, everything went wrong at once. Jake's canoe had 3 long gashes in the hull, as if something with claws had raked across the fiberglass. Tom's entire pack was missing, including his sleeping bag, clothes, and most of our medical supplies. My paddle had been snapped in half, the brake showing splintered wood that looked like it had been chewed. Worst of all, when Sarah tried to retrace our route using her backup compass, it spun wildly, never settling on any particular direction. The magnetic needle just whirled in lazy circles, as if we were standing on top of a massive iron deposit. "The maps," Sarah said desperately, spreading out her topographical charts. But the paper was wrong. Not damaged, but wrong. The features shown on the map no longer corresponded to our surroundings. Streams flowed in different directions, hills appeared where valleys should be, and our camp was supposedly located in the middle of a swamp that clearly didn't exist. "This isn't possible," Tom whispered, his voice barely audible. He'd been staring at the ruined maps with an expression of such pure terror that I was genuinely worried he might have a complete breakdown. "Magnetic anomaly," Sarah said, but she didn't sound convinced. "Solar flares can affect navigation equipment, and paper maps can be misprinted." She was grasping for rational explanations, but we all knew something far beyond normal had us in its grip. That's when we heard Danny calling for help. His voice drifted through the trees, thin and desperate. "Guys, help me, I'm hurt." We looked at each other with sick understanding. We'd all seen the thing that had worn Danny's face the night before, but the voice sounded so genuinely distressed, so perfectly like our friend, that doubt crept in despite everything. "It's not him," Sarah said firmly. "Danny is gone. That thing killed him and now it's wearing his face." "But what if—" Jake started. "No." Sarah's voice cut like a blade. "That's how these things work. They make you doubt. They make you hope. And then they kill you." The calls continued throughout the day, sometimes close, sometimes distant, always just desperate enough to make us consider responding. But Sarah was right. Whatever had taken Danny was trying to lure us away from each other, and we couldn't let that happen. By afternoon, Tom was talking to himself in a constant, low whisper, his eyes darting constantly toward the tree line. Jake had become increasingly aggressive, snapping at all of us and muttering about how we should have tried harder to find Danny. The stress was breaking us down, exactly what the thing wanted. That's when Sarah made her confession. "I lied about this being a random route," she said quietly as we huddled around another failing fire. "I chose this area specifically because of the disappearances, because of the legends." We stared at her in shocked silence. "My brother came here 15 years ago with a group from his college. They found 4 of the 5 bodies eventually, but Mark was never recovered. The survivors, they were never the same. They kept talking about something in the woods that could wear human faces, something that was always hungry." "Jesus Christ, Sarah," Jake snarled. "You brought us here knowing it was dangerous?" "I thought it was just trauma response," she said defensively. "Survivor's guilt manifesting a shared delusion. I wanted to prove the legends were just that. Legends, but I was wrong. God help us, I was wrong." Before anyone could respond, Tom let out a scream that turned my blood to ice water. He was pointing at the tree line, his whole body shaking. Emerging from between the trees was Danny again. But this version was different from the one we'd seen the night before. This Danny looked exactly as he had when he'd left to gather firewood. Clean clothes, normal proportions, genuine expression of confusion and fear. "What's wrong?" he called out. "Why are you all looking at me like that? I've been lost all day. Something attacked me in the woods, tore up my clothes. I had to find new ones." He gestured to his outfit, which was indeed different from what he'd been wearing. This Danny looked real. This Danny looked right. "How do we know it's really you?" Sarah demanded, her knife now openly in her hand. Danny's face crumpled with hurt confusion. "What do you mean? Of course it's me. Sarah, what's wrong with you? Why are you holding a knife?" "The thing last night," I said carefully. "It looked like you too." "What thing?" "I've been lost in the woods since yesterday. I spent the night in a cave, trying to stay warm. I've been trying to find you all day." His story sounded reasonable. His reactions seemed genuine. But how could we trust anything anymore? "Prove it," Jake said suddenly. "Tell us something only Danny would know." Danny looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Are you serious?" "Fine. Jake, you wet the bed until you were 12, and you made me promise never to tell anyone when we were roommates freshman year. Tom, you're secretly afraid of butterflies because your sister convinced you they were poisonous when you were 5. Sarah, you've been in love with your climbing partner Elena for 3 years, but you're too scared to tell her. Mike," he turned to me with sad eyes, "Lisa left you because you wouldn't commit to having kids, but the real reason you wouldn't commit is because your dad walked out when you were 8, and you're terrified you'll do the same thing." The accuracy of these revelations hit like physical blows. These were things only Danny knew, secrets shared during late-night conversations and drunken confessions. This had to be the real Danny. But then he smiled, and I saw the same too-wide grin from the night before. "The question is," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "which one of you isn't real?" Tom snapped first. He grabbed a burning branch from the fire and swung it at Danny's head with a wordless shriek. Danny moved with inhuman speed, flowing aside like liquid. The burning wood passed harmlessly through the space where his head had been, and he laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Wrong choice, Tommy." What happened next violated every natural law I'd ever believed in. Danny's form began to shift and stretch, his limbs elongating impossibly while his torso remained human-sized. His clothes dissolved into shadow, revealing pale skin covered in geometric scars that seemed to move and writhe in the firelight. His face split open like a flower, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth and a black throat that seemed to go down forever. The thing that had been Danny reached out with arms that were now too long, too thin, ending in hands with too many joints. It grabbed Tom around the waist with casual ease and lifted him off the ground. Tom's screams were cut short as those impossible jaws opened wider than any mouth should be able to open. I watched in helpless horror as the creature bit down on Tom's shoulder, tearing away a chunk of flesh and muscle with a wet, ripping sound. Blood sprayed across the campsite in a crimson arc, spattering the trees and our gear. Tom's scream became a gurgle as the thing bit down again, this time on his neck. I could hear the vertebrae crack like kindling. The creature's throat worked convulsively as it swallowed, and Tom's struggles grew weaker. Jake was fumbling for something in his pack, probably his knife, but his hands were shaking too badly to find it. Sarah had gone into some kind of shock, just standing frozen with her mouth open. I felt like I was underwater, everything happening too slowly and too fast at the same time. The creature that had been Danny dropped Tom's lifeless body and turned toward us. Tom's blood still dripping from its distended jaws. When it spoke, its voice was a chorus of whispers, as if multiple people were speaking in perfect unison. "Who wants to play next?" That broke the spell. Sarah screamed something that might have been a word in another language, and suddenly the forest erupted into chaos. The trees around us began to sway and crack despite the absence of any wind. The fire roared up into a pillar of flame that reached towards the low-hanging clouds, and something roared back from deep in the woods, something much larger than the creature wearing Danny's face. "Run!" Sarah shouted, grabbing Jake's arm and hauling him toward the water. The canoes. I didn't need to be told twice. We sprinted toward the shoreline, crashing through the underbrush while inhuman sounds echoed behind us. I could hear the Danny thing laughing, but the sound was coming from multiple directions at once, as if there were several of them. We reached the water and discovered that only one canoe remained intact. The others had been reduced to splinters and torn canvas. The single surviving canoe was my solo craft. Barely big enough for 2 people, definitely not 3. "Take it," Sarah said, shoving the paddle into my hands. "Get out of here. Find help." I'm not leaving you," I protested, but she was already pushing the canoe into the water. "Someone has to survive to warn people," she said grimly, "and I have some things to answer for." She pressed something into my hand, a small leather pouch that felt warm despite the cold air. This was my brother's Micmac protection charm. It might help. Jake climbed into the canoe behind me, his face white with shock. "Sarah, come on." She shook her head, then pushed us hard out into the dark water. "Go! Now!" I paddled frantically, putting distance between us and the shore. Behind us, the forest had erupted into complete chaos. Trees were falling with thunderous crashes, and I could see shapes moving between them. Shapes that were too large and moved in ways that hurt to look at. Sarah stood on the shore, arms raised, shouting words in a language I didn't recognize. For a moment, she seemed to glow with a faint silver light. Then something vast and dark burst from the tree line and engulfed her. Her screams cut off abruptly. Jake and I paddled like our lives depended on it, because they did. The water around us had turned black as oil, and things moved beneath the surface. Long, sinuous shapes that occasionally broke the water with a sound like breaking bones. "The map," Jake gasped between paddle strokes. "Check Sarah's map." I fumbled for the topographical chart, nearly dropping it into the water. When I spread it out, my heart stopped. The paper was blank except for a single word written in what looked like dried blood. Canoe. Even as I watched, more text began to appear, as if an invisible hand was writing across the paper. "The hunger spreads. The old ways return. None who enter leave unchanged." I crumpled the map and threw it into the water, where it dissolved instantly like it had been made of sugar. We paddled through the night, following what I hoped was Allagash Stream, though the landscape around us bore no resemblance to anything on any map. The water carried us past floating islands of vegetation that moved with deliberate purpose, through narrow channels where the trees on either side whispered to each other in voices almost too low to hear. Jake didn't speak after the first hour. When I turned to check on him, I saw that his eyes had gone completely black, just like the first Danny thing. But he was still paddling, still helping us move downstream, so I didn't say anything. What could I do? Jump out and swim? I was trapped in a canoe with something that wore my friend's face, fleeing through a landscape that had become a nightmare. The worst part was that I was starting to hunger. It began as a normal appetite, the kind you'd expect after a day of strenuous paddling and mortal terror. But as the hours passed, it grew into something else entirely. A gnawing, consuming need that had nothing to do with food. I found myself looking at Jake's neck, thinking about how thin his skin looked, how easily it would tear. The leather pouch Sarah had given me grew hot against my palm, and the hunger receded slightly. But I could feel it there, waiting, growing stronger. By dawn, we reached what looked like a legitimate waterway. The GPS in my phone flickered to life long enough to show we were somehow near the town of Allagash, though that should have been impossible given the distance we'd traveled. Jake was still Jake, or at least appeared to be, though he hadn't spoken in hours. We beached the canoe and hiked to the nearest road, where a concerned motorist picked us up and drove us to the local police station. I told them our friends had gone missing during a camping trip, provided the coordinates where we'd last seen them. The search and rescue teams found our campsite 3 days later. They found Tom's body, or what was left of it. The official report blamed a bear attack, though the wounds didn't match any known animal. They never found Sarah or Danny, despite extensive searching. Jake recovered quickly, at least on the surface. He claimed to have no memory of anything after Danny first disappeared, which the trauma counselors said was normal. But I noticed things. The way he never blinked when he was concentrating. How he sometimes forgot to breathe for minutes at a time. The fact that he'd gained 30 pounds in the months since our return, but never seemed to eat anything. And the way he looked at people, like he was calculating something. I tried to warn people. I filed reports, contacted paranormal investigators, even reached out to the Micmac Tribal Council. Most dismissed me as a traumatized survivor dealing with guilt and PTSD. The few who believed me advised staying away from the Allagash region entirely. The leather pouch Sarah gave me crumbled to dust exactly 1 year after our trip. On that same night, I woke to find Jake standing at the foot of my bed, smiling that too wide smile in the darkness. When I turned on the lights, he was gone, but there were muddy footprints leading from my front door to my bedroom. I moved to California the next week. That was 5 years ago. I've built a new life here, far from the dark waters and ancient hungers of the Allagash. I married Rebecca last spring and we're expecting our first child in December. I've almost convinced myself that what happened in those woods was some kind of shared psychotic break, that the isolation and stress caused us all to hallucinate. Almost. But sometimes, late at night, I catch Rebecca looking at me with eyes that reflect light like an animal's. Sometimes I wake up to find her standing motionless beside our bed, watching me with an expression I can't read. And sometimes, when she thinks I'm not listening, I hear her whispering to something in the darkness. The hunger never really goes away. It just waits. And now, with a child coming, I understand why the old legends spoke of generations cursed, of entire bloodlines twisted by ancient hungers. The thing that wears my wife's face has been very patient, very careful, but I can feel its anticipation growing as her pregnancy progresses. I've started researching the old protections again, looking for something stronger than Sarah's leather pouch, because I know now that the Chenu doesn't just hunt in the wilderness. It follows you home. It gets into your life, your relationships, your family. It's been waiting 5 years for this moment, and in 3 months when our child is born, it will finally be ready to feed again. The hunger spreads. The old ways return, and none who enter ever truly leave. My name is James Anderson, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the Allagash Wilderness Waterway in northern Maine, 70 miles from the nearest town, where the forest stretches endlessly in every direction like a green ocean that swallows sound and light. Michael Williams and I had been planning this trip for months. We'd been friends since college, and after my brother Danny died in that car accident 3 years ago, Michael was the one who pulled me out of the darkness. He insisted I needed to get back into the wilderness, back to the places that used to bring me peace. The woods don't judge, James, he'd said. They just exist. Sometimes that's exactly what you need. So there we were, driving his beat-up Ford pickup down the increasingly narrow dirt roads that led to our put-in point at Chamberlain Lake. The October air carried the sharp bite of approaching winter, and the maples blazed orange and red against the gray sky. Michael was excited, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel as he talked about the brook trout we'd catch and the silence we'd find. "Remember that time we got lost near Katahdin?" He laughed, referencing a college adventure that had become legend between us. 3 days eating nothing but granola bars and pond water. I smiled, but something felt off. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed to press closer to the road than I remembered, or how the shadows between them appeared darker, more solid. The GPS on Michael's phone had started glitching about 20 miles back, showing us in the middle of Chamberlain Lake even though we were clearly on dry land. "Technology," Michael had shrugged when I pointed it out. "Never works right up here anyway." We reached the canoe launch as the sun began its descent toward the tree line. The lake stretched before us, mirror still and reflecting the sky like black glass. Our plan was simple: paddle to one of the remote campsites on the far shore, set up for 3 nights, fish during the day, and remember what it felt like to exist without the constant buzz of civilization. The canoe cut through the water with barely a sound. Michael paddled in the stern while I navigated from the bow, though navigation was almost pointless. The lake was empty except for us, and our destination was simply the other side. The silence was profound, broken only by the dip and pull of our paddles and the occasional call of a loon somewhere in the distance. It was as we approached the far shore that I first noticed something wrong. The campsite we'd chosen from the map, a designated spot marked clearly on both our paper charts and the outdated GPS, wasn't there. Instead of the cleared area with a fire ring and bear box that should have been waiting for us, we found only unbroken forest coming right down to the water's edge. "Must be the wrong bay," Michael said, though I could hear uncertainty in his voice. We paddled along the shoreline for another half hour, searching for any sign of human presence, any indication that people had ever camped here before. Nothing. "Screw it," Michael finally declared as the shadows began to lengthen. "We'll make our own campsite, probably better than some overcrowded designated spot anyway." We found a small clearing about 50 yards from the water, just large enough for our 2 tents with a relatively flat spot for a fire ring. As we began setting up camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The sensation crawled up my spine like cold fingers, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few minutes, scanning the tree line for movement that never came. Michael noticed my nervousness. "You okay, man? You seem jumpy." "Just the quiet, I guess. Takes some getting used to after the city." But it wasn't the quiet. It was the wrongness of it. In all my years of wilderness camping, I'd never experienced silence like this. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, no insects buzzing. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. We got our fire going just as full darkness fell, and for a while, the warm glow of the flames pushed back my uneasiness. We cooked simple camp meals: freeze-dried pasta for Michael, instant rice and canned salmon for me, and shared a bottle of whiskey Michael had smuggled in. The alcohol helped, loosening the knots in my shoulders and bringing back some of the easy camaraderie that had defined our friendship. "Remember when you taught me to tie a bowline?" Michael asked, poking at the fire with a stick. "I must have practiced it 1,000 times before I got it right." "You were determined," I agreed. Danny always said determination was worth more than natural talent. Michael's expression softened. He knew how much I still missed my brother, how Danny's death had left a hole in my life that I was still trying to fill. "He would have loved this trip," Michael said quietly. "He always talked about wanting to go deeper into the wilderness than you two ever went as kids." I nodded, not trusting my voice. Danny and I had taken dozens of camping trips together before the accident, but we'd always stuck to the more accessible areas, the places with maintained trails and reliable cell service. This isolation, this complete separation from the civilized world, was exactly the kind of adventure Danny had dreamed about. As the night deepened, the fire began to behave strangely. The flames, which had been burning clean and yellow, started flickering with touches of green and blue. At first, I thought it might be some chemical in the wood we'd gathered, but the colors became more pronounced, dancing and swirling in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. "You seeing this?" I asked Michael, pointing at the fire. He followed my gaze and frowned. "Weird. Must be something in the wood. Pine sap, maybe?" But the flames weren't behaving like any wood fire I'd ever seen. They pulsed and shifted, and in their movement I could swear I saw shapes, twisted forms that looked almost like faces, mouths open in silent screams. I blinked hard, telling myself it was the whiskey and the exhaustion playing tricks on me. That's when we heard the sound. It started low, almost below the threshold of hearing, a rumbling that seemed to come from deep underground. As it grew louder, it became recognizable as a voice. or something like a voice. It was calling a name, but the sound was so distorted, so wrong, that it took me several seconds to realize what it was saying. Danny, Danny, Danny. My blood turned to ice. Michael grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my jacket. What the hell is that? The voice came again, closer this time, definitely from somewhere in the forest around our camp. But it wasn't quite right. The pronunciation was off, like someone who had heard the name but never learned how to say it properly. The syllables were stretched and twisted, filled with harmonics that made my teeth ache. "James," Michael whispered, "we need to get out of here." But I couldn't move. The voice was calling my brother's name, and despite every rational part of my brain screaming that this was impossible, that Danny was dead and buried 3 years ago, part of me wanted to answer. Part of me wanted to call back, to see if somehow, impossibly, my brother had found his way to this remote place. The calling stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it felt like being underwater. The fire had returned to normal yellow flames, as if nothing had happened. Michael and I sat frozen, staring at each other across the dying light. "We're leaving in the morning," Michael said firmly. "First light, we pack up and paddle back to the truck." I wanted to agree, but something held me back. Maybe it was just an animal. Loons can make some pretty weird sounds. That wasn't a loon, James. That was... He shuddered. That was something else. We banked the fire and retreated to our tents, but sleep was impossible. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to every sound, real or imagined, that came from the darkness outside. The thin nylon walls of my tent felt pathetically inadequate against whatever was out there, and I found myself holding my breath whenever I heard the slightest rustle in the trees. Sometime around 3 in the morning, I must have finally dozed off, because I was awakened by a sound that sent adrenaline shooting through my system like an electric shock. Someone was unzipping Michael's tent. The sound was unmistakable. The slow, deliberate pull of a zipper, tooth by tooth. But it was coming from outside the tent, not inside. I grabbed my flashlight and listened intently, every muscle in my body coiled tight. The unzipping continued for what felt like an eternity. And then there was silence. "Michael," I whispered. No response. I forced myself to wait another 10 minutes before unzipping my own tent and stepping into the cold night air. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating Michael's tent just 20 feet away. The front zipper was open completely, the tent gaping like a mouth, and it was empty. His sleeping bag was there, unzipped from the inside, but Michael was gone. "Michael," I called, sweeping my light in wide arcs around the campsite. "Michael, where are you?" The beam revealed something that made my stomach clench. Michael's boots were still outside his tent, lined up neatly as if he'd stepped out of them carefully. But there were no footprints leading away, no sign of disturbance, nothing to indicate which direction he might have gone. I spent the next hour searching the immediate area, calling his name until my voice was hoarse. The forest swallowed my shouts without even an echo, and my flashlight seemed pathetically weak against the vast darkness surrounding our small camp. Every shadow could have been hiding something, and every tree could have been sheltering whatever had taken my friend. As dawn finally began to creep across the sky, painting the eastern horizon a sick yellow-gray, I heard footsteps approaching through the trees. Heavy, deliberate steps that cracked branches and crushed leaves. I spun toward the sound, my flashlight raised like a weapon. "Michael?" He emerged from the tree line, and at first glance he looked normal. Same clothes, same messy brown hair, same familiar face that had been my friend for over a decade. But something was wrong. Something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. He was smiling. Not the easy, natural grin I knew so well, but something forced and too wide, stretching his features in a way that made him look like a poorly made replica of himself. His eyes, which should have been the warm brown I remembered, seemed darker, deeper, as if someone had filled them with black water. "Hey, James," he said, and even his voice was wrong. The inflection was off, like he was reading from a script he didn't quite understand. "Sorry about that. Had to take a leak." "You were gone for hours," I said, not lowering the flashlight. "I was calling for you." "Hours?" He tilted his head and the movement was too sharp, too quick. Couldn't have been more than a few minutes. But the sky was already brightening, and we both knew it was morning. He'd been gone all night, walking around barefoot in near-freezing temperatures in a forest full of rocks and thorns, and there wasn't a scratch on him. "Where are your boots?" I asked. He looked down at his bare feet as if noticing them for the first time. "Oh, must have forgotten them." The smile never wavered. "You know how it is when you wake up disoriented." "Yeah, I didn't know how it was, because this wasn't how Michael behaved. The real Michael was methodical, careful, the kind of person who would never walk into a wilderness bathroom break without proper footwear. The real Michael would have been apologetic about worrying me, would have explained where he'd been and why he'd stayed out so long. This thing wearing Michael's face just kept smiling. "We should break camp," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Get back to the truck." "Already?" The smile flickered for just a moment, and in that flicker I saw something else underneath, something hungry and predatory that made my skin crawl. "We just got here. Don't you want to stay and enjoy the wilderness?" There was something in the way he said wilderness that made it sound like he was savoring the word, rolling it around in his mouth like a piece of meat. I took a step backward, my hand moving instinctively to the bear spray clipped to my belt. "I think we should go," I repeated. "Sure, James, whatever you want." But he didn't move to pack up his tent. He just stood there at the edge of our campsite, barefoot in the morning frost, smiling that terrible smile and watching me with those blackwater eyes. I began breaking down my own tent with shaking hands, never taking my eyes off him for more than a few seconds at a time. He didn't help, didn't move to gather his own gear, just watched with that predatory patience that reminded me of a cat studying a wounded bird. As I stuffed my sleeping bag into its compression sack, I noticed something that made my heart nearly stop. Michael's tent was already packed. Not just folded, completely packed as if he'd done it in the dark while I was searching for him. The gear was arranged with military precision in a neat pile beside where the tent had been. But I hadn't heard him packing, hadn't seen him do it. When had he found the time? And why was he pretending he was still here, still in his tent, when clearly he'd been up and active for hours? "Ready to go?" he asked, shouldering his pack with fluid, economical movements that were nothing like Michael's usual slightly clumsy fumbling with gear. I nodded, not trusting my voice. We walked to the water's edge where we'd beached the canoe, and I was relieved to see it was exactly where we'd left it. For a moment, I'd been afraid it might have disappeared, stranding us in this place with whatever was wearing my friend's face. The paddle back across the lake was the longest hour of my life. Michael, or the thing that looked like Michael, sat in the stern, steering us toward the truck with mechanical precision. He didn't speak, didn't make any of the casual observations about the weather or the scenery that would have been normal for him. He just paddled with inhuman efficiency, never seeming to tire, never adjusting his rhythm. Halfway across the lake, I realized he wasn't breathing hard. We'd been paddling for 30 minutes in cold air, working against a crosswind that was making the canoe fight every stroke. I was breathing hard, my breath visible in white puffs, my shoulders burning from the effort. But Michael's breathing was slow and steady, barely visible, as if this was no more strenuous than sitting in a chair. I turned to look at him and found those black eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The smile was gone now, replaced by an expression of naked hunger that transformed his familiar features into something monstrous. "You know," he said conversationally, "your brother tasted delicious." The words hit me like a physical blow. I nearly dropped my paddle, the canoe wobbling dangerously as I spun around to face him fully. "What did you say?" "Danny. Sweet, tender Danny. He came to me in the woods, you know, just like you're going to." "Danny's dead," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "He died in a car accident." "Did he?" The thing wearing Michael's face laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. Or did he die in the woods, calling your name while I fed on his terror? While I learned his voice, his memories, his love for his brother James? I tried to process what he was saying, but it was like trying to hold water in my hands. None of it made sense. Danny had died on I-95, hit by a drunk driver at 2 in the afternoon. I'd seen the accident report, attended the funeral, helped carry his casket, but the voice last night, calling Danny's name. "You're lying," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, doubt began creeping in. There had been inconsistencies in the official story, details that had never quite added up. Danny had been driving to meet me for a camping trip, a trip he'd never told anyone else about. The accident had happened on a stretch of road he had no reason to be on, miles from any route between his apartment and our planned meeting spot. Am I? The Michael thing leaned forward, and I could smell something wrong with his breath, something like rotting meat and pine needles. Tell me, James, have you ever wondered why he was really driving that day? What he was really running from? I wanted to paddle faster, to get to shore and run, but my arms felt like lead. The thing in the stern continued its steady rhythm, propelling us inexorably toward the landing where my truck waited, where I'd be alone with this creature in the vast wilderness, miles from any help. "The hunger is ancient," it continued, its voice taking on a sing-song quality that made my teeth ache. "Older than your civilization, older than your roads and your cars and your convenient explanations. It lives in the deep places, in the spaces between trees where your maps have nothing but green, and it's always hungry." "What are you?" I managed to ask. "I am the shadow behind the shadow, the winter that never ends, the hunger that consumes everything it touches. Your people have a name for me, borrowed from older peoples who knew better than to walk alone in the deep woods. Wendigo." The word hit me like a physical blow. I'd heard the legends, read the stories around campfires, but I'd always dismissed them as folklore, stories told to keep children from wandering too far into the forest. The Wendigo was supposed to be a cannibal creature, a human who had resorted to eating human flesh in the depths of winter starvation and been transformed into something monstrous as punishment. But this felt real. This felt like truth. "Michael fought harder than your brother," the creature continued conversationally. "More experience in the wilderness, better survival instincts, but in the end they all taste the same: fear and meat and the salt of tears." "Where is he?" I demanded. "What did you do with him?" "I am him. He is me. We are one flesh now, one hunger." It smiled again, and this time I could see that its teeth were wrong. Too sharp, too many, filling its mouth like a shark's. "Just as you and I will be one flesh soon." The canoe scraped against the rocky shore with a grinding sound that seemed abnormally loud in the still air. The thing that had been Michael stepped out gracefully, pulling the bow up onto the beach with strength that no human should have possessed. I sat frozen in the stern, knowing that the moment I stepped onto land, the chase would begin. "Come on, James," it said, extending a hand toward me. "Let's finish this." I looked at that outstretched hand, Michael's hand down to the scar on his knuckle from a childhood accident he'd told me about 100 times, and felt something break inside me. Whether this thing was telling the truth about Danny or not, it had killed my best friend. It had taken his form, his memories, his voice, and it was using them to torment me. Instead of taking the offered hand, I grabbed my paddle and swung it like a baseball bat. The blade caught the creature across the side of its head with a sound like splitting wood. It staggered backward, black blood flowing from the wound, but instead of going down, it just laughed. The laughter echoed across the empty lake, a sound full of malice and hunger that made my bones ache. "There's the spirit," it said, reaching up to touch the wound. When it pulled its hand away, the black blood was already congealing, the gash already beginning to heal. This will be more fun than I thought. I scrambled out of the canoe and ran for the truck, my feet slipping and sliding on the wet rocks. Behind me, I could hear the creature following, but its footsteps sounded wrong, too light, too fast, as if it wasn't quite touching the ground. The truck keys were in my pocket, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get them out. I fumbled with the lock, dropped the keys, snatched them up again. The creature was almost at the truck now, moving with that fluid, inhuman grace that was nothing like Michael's natural clumsiness. The door opened just as it reached me. I threw myself into the driver's seat and slammed the lock down, but I knew it wouldn't matter. This thing had strength enough to tear the door off its hinges if it wanted to. Instead, it just stood beside the truck and smiled, tapping gently on the window with one finger. Tap, tap, tap. "You can't run forever, James," it said, its voice muffled by the glass but still clearly audible. "This is my territory. These are my woods, and I know exactly where you're going to go." I turned the key, and the engine turned over on the first try. Without bothering to warm it up, I threw it into reverse and floored the accelerator. The truck shot backward, and for a moment I thought I might actually escape. Then I saw the creature in my rearview mirror. It wasn't running after the truck. It was just standing there, watching me go, and it was still smiling. As I watched, it raised one hand and waved goodbye, a casual, friendly gesture that was somehow more terrifying than any threat could have been. I drove faster than I'd ever driven on those narrow dirt roads, the truck bouncing and sliding through potholes and around sharp curves that could have killed me if I'd misjudged them by inches. But I didn't care. All I cared about was putting distance between myself and that thing, getting back to civilization where there were people and lights and safety. It wasn't until I reached the main road, real asphalt with painted lines and speed limit signs, that I allowed myself to believe I might actually escape. I pulled over at the first gas station I found and called 911, babbling about my missing friend and something in the woods that wasn't human. The state police were polite but skeptical. They took my statement, filed a missing person report for Michael, and promised to send a search team to investigate the area where we'd been camping. I gave them GPS coordinates, drew maps, described every detail I could remember about our campsite and the surrounding terrain. They never found any trace of Michael Williams. No body, no equipment, no sign that he'd ever been in those woods at all. The official report concluded that he'd likely fallen into the lake and drowned, and that trauma had caused me to create false memories to cope with losing my friend. I know better. I know that something ancient and hungry lives in the deep places of the Maine woods, something that wears the faces of the people it kills and feeds on human flesh and fear. I know that my brother Danny didn't die in a car accident. He died alone in the forest, calling my name while that thing learned how to be him. And I know that someday it's going to come for me. I've moved 3 times since that camping trip. Always to cities, always to places with lots of people and artificial light. I don't go camping anymore, don't even walk through urban parks after dark. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I hear something tapping at my window. Tap, tap, tap. And when I look, there's nothing there. Nothing but darkness and the reflection of my own terrified face staring back at me from the glass. But I know it's out there. Waiting, watching, learning, and getting hungrier every day. Last week, I got a text message from Michael's phone number. Just 2 words. Coming soon. The thing is, Michael's phone was never found with his body, because there was no body to find. Just a Wendigo wearing his face, carrying his memories, and using his phone to play with its food. I've been researching ways to kill a Wendigo, but the old stories don't agree on much except that they're nearly impossible to destroy. Fire, silver, blessed weapons, different sources give different answers, and I don't know which ones to trust. What I do know is that I can't run forever. The thing in the woods knows me now, knows my scent and my fears and the taste of my terror. It's patient, but it won't wait indefinitely. So I'm writing this down, all of it, everything that happened in those woods beside Chamberlain Lake. If something happens to me, if I disappear or die under mysterious circumstances, I want someone to know the truth. I want them to know that there are worse things in the wilderness than bears or hypothermia or getting lost. There are things that were never human, things that hunger for more than just flesh. things that feed on the bonds between people, that destroy families and friendships with the same casual ease that a child tears the wings off a fly. The Wendigo is real, and it's coming for me. I just hope when it does, I have the strength to fight back, because I won't let it wear my face. I won't let it use my voice to call other people into the darkness, even if I have to die to stop it. The tapping at my window is getting louder. My name is David Jones, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote backcountry of Maine, near Katahdin Stream Falls, in October of last year. I'm writing this down because the authorities won't believe what I witnessed, and I need someone to know the truth about what happened to my friends in those cursed woods. It was supposed to be a simple 3-day hiking trip. Me, my college buddies Michael Williams and Christopher Hernandez, along with Michael's girlfriend Jennifer Williams, had planned this getaway for months. We'd all been struggling with the stress of our corporate jobs, and the idea of disconnecting from civilization for a long weekend seemed like exactly what we needed. The Appalachian Trail near Baxter State Park offered the perfect escape, remote enough to feel truly isolated, but well-marked enough that we wouldn't get lost. Or so we thought. The drive up to the trailhead took us through increasingly desolate country. Past Millinocket, the towns grew smaller and more run down. The trees pressed closer to the road, and cell phone reception became spotty, then non-existent. By the time we reached the Katahdin Stream Falls parking area, the October sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows through the pine and birch forest. "Jesus, it's quiet up here," Jennifer said as we shouldered our packs. She was a small, energetic woman with short auburn hair, the type who usually filled silence with nervous chatter. But even she seemed subdued by the oppressive stillness of the woods. Michael, her boyfriend of 2 years, was our de facto leader, the one who'd organized the trip, studied the maps, and packed enough gear for a month-long expedition. He was methodical, cautious, the kind of guy who checked and double-checked everything. "That's the point, Jen," he said, adjusting the straps on his massive backpack. "No traffic, no deadlines, no emails. Just us and nature." Christopher was the opposite, spontaneous, reckless, always looking for his next adrenaline fix. He'd been the one pushing for us to take the more challenging trail, to venture deeper into the backcountry than the standard tourist routes. "Come on, you guys," he said, practically bouncing on his feet. "When's the next time we're going to have a chance like this? Let's really get away from it all." I should have listened to the part of my brain that was already uneasy. The forest felt wrong somehow. Too quiet, too still. Even the usual October sounds were missing. No birds calling from the trees, no squirrels rustling through the fallen leaves, no insects buzzing in the underbrush. Just an absolute, tomb-like silence that seemed to swallow our voices and footsteps. But I was outvoted, and honestly, I wanted to believe that a few days in the wilderness would help me sort through the mess my life had become. My divorce had been finalized 6 months earlier, my ex-wife had taken half of everything, and I'd been living in a studio apartment, eating takeout every night and slowly drinking myself into oblivion. Maybe some fresh air and physical exhaustion would reset my head. We hiked for about 2 hours before making camp near a small clearing roughly 3 miles off the main trail. Michael had identified the spot on his topographical map, close enough to Katahdin Stream that we'd have access to water, but far enough from the popular camping areas that we'd have complete privacy. The sun was setting as we pitched our tents, and the temperature was dropping fast. Even through my heavy jacket, I could feel the October chill seeping into my bones. The forest around us had taken on an almost malevolent quality in the fading light, the bare branches of the deciduous trees reaching out like gnarled fingers against the darkening sky. "Anybody else think it's weird how quiet it is?" Jennifer asked as we gathered around the fire Michael had built. She kept glancing over her shoulder at the tree line, as if expecting something to emerge from the darkness. "It's October," Michael said pragmatically. "Most of the wildlife is either migrating or preparing for winter. It's normal." But even as he said it, I could tell he didn't entirely believe it. His eyes kept darting to the shadows between the trees. and he'd positioned himself so that his back was to the fire and he was facing outward toward the forest. Christopher was the only one who seemed completely at ease. He'd found a deadfall log to sit on and was working his way through a flask of bourbon, his face flushed from the alcohol and the heat of the fire. "You're all being paranoid," he said with a laugh. "This is exactly what we came here for. Peace and quiet." I tried to relax, but something about the silence was genuinely disturbing. It wasn't just the absence of animal sounds. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The fire crackled and popped, but even those sounds seemed muffled, absorbed by the oppressive darkness that pressed in around our small circle of light. We ate our dinner of freeze-dried camping food mostly in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. As the night wore on, the temperature continued to drop, and we gradually moved closer to the fire, seeking warmth and the psychological comfort of the light. It was around midnight when we heard the first howl. It came from somewhere deep in the forest, a long, mournful sound that raised the hair on the back of my neck. It didn't sound like any wolf or coyote I'd ever heard. There was something almost human about it, but stretched and distorted in a way that made my skin crawl. "What the hell was that?" Jennifer whispered, moving closer to Michael. "Probably a coyote," Michael said, but his voice was tight with tension. "They sound different up here in the mountains." The howl came again, closer this time, and definitely not from a coyote. There was an intelligence to it, a deliberate quality that suggested whatever was making the sound was aware of our presence and was trying to communicate something. Or perhaps it was trying to frighten us. If that was the goal, it was working. "Maybe we should put out the fire," Jennifer suggested. "It's like a beacon, letting everything know where we are." "No," Christopher said firmly. "Fire keeps animals away. Basic camping knowledge." But as he spoke, another howl echoed through the forest, and this one was answered by a second voice from a different direction. Then a third, and a fourth, until it seemed like we were surrounded by unseen creatures calling to each other in that horrible, almost human wail. "Fuck this," I said, standing up and kicking dirt onto the fire. "I'm with Jennifer. Let's douse the light and wait this out." Michael nodded and helped me extinguish the flames. The darkness that enveloped us was absolute, the kind of impenetrable blackness that exists only in deep wilderness, far from any source of artificial light. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face, couldn't even make out the shapes of my friends who I knew were sitting just a few feet away. The howling continued for another hour, moving around our campsite in what seemed like a coordinated pattern. Sometimes the sounds came from the tree line to our north, sometimes from the creek to our east, sometimes from directly behind us. Whatever was out there, there were multiple creatures, and they were definitely aware of our presence. Finally, mercifully, the sounds faded away, and we were left alone with the silence once again. We sat in the darkness for what felt like hours, nobody wanting to be the first to suggest we try to get some sleep. When morning finally came, I was relieved to see that everything looked normal. Our campsite was undisturbed, our gear was where we'd left it, and there were no signs that anything had approached during the night. In the clear light of day, the previous evening's events seemed almost like a shared nightmare. "Probably just a pack of coyotes," Michael said as we broke camp, though he kept scanning the tree line nervously. "They were probably just curious about the fire." I wanted to believe him, but something still felt wrong. The forest was still too quiet, still missing the normal sounds of wildlife, and there was a smell in the air, something foul and organic, like rotting meat mixed with wet fur. We hiked deeper into the backcountry that day, following what Michael claimed was an old logging road marked on his map. But as the hours passed, I began to doubt that we were following any kind of established trail. The path was overgrown and difficult to follow, and we seemed to be climbing steadily upward into terrain that was increasingly rough and rocky. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" I asked Michael during one of our rest stops. "This doesn't look like any logging road I've ever seen." He consulted his map and compass for the dozenth time that day, a frown creasing his forehead. "The map shows a trail here," he said uncertainly. "But you're right. It doesn't look like it's been used in years. Maybe we should turn back, Jennifer suggested. We could camp somewhere closer to the main trail tonight. Come on, don't be such babies, Christopher said. He'd been pushing ahead of the group all day, eager to explore deeper into the wilderness. This is an adventure. When's the last time any of us did something that wasn't completely predictable and safe? Despite my growing unease, I found myself agreeing with him. There was something appealing about the idea of really getting away from civilization, of experiencing the kind of true wilderness that most people never see. And besides, Michael was an experienced hiker. If he said we could handle it, then we probably could. By late afternoon, we'd climbed high enough that we could see Mount Katahdin in the distance, its rocky peak rising above the forest like an ancient monument. The view was breathtaking, but it also emphasized just how isolated we were. In every direction, there was nothing but endless forest, broken only by the occasional gleam of a distant lake or stream. We made camp that night in a small meadow surrounded by towering pine trees. The silence was even more pronounced here, if that was possible, and the smell I'd noticed that morning was stronger. It seemed to be coming from somewhere to the north of our campsite, carried on the slight breeze that rustled through the trees. "Does anyone else smell that?" Jennifer asked as we sat around our evening fire. She'd been increasingly nervous throughout the day, jumping at every shadow and sound. "Smell what?" Christopher asked, though I could tell from his expression that he was aware of the odor too. "Like something died," she said. "Something big." Michael nodded grimly. "Probably a moose or a deer. It's hunting season. Maybe a hunter wounded something and it crawled off to die." But even as he offered the rational explanation, I could see the doubt in his eyes. The smell was too strong, too pervasive to be coming from a single dead animal. And there was something else about it, a sweetness underneath the rot that made my stomach turn. We went to bed early that night, each of us retreating to our individual tents as soon as it was fully dark. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the silence, which seemed to have weight and presence of its own. Every few minutes I thought I heard something moving outside, a soft footstep on the pine needles, a branch breaking under some unseen weight, but when I strained to listen more carefully, there was nothing. I must have dozed off at some point because I was awakened by the sound of someone unzipping their tent. I checked my watch, 3:17 a.m. Through the thin fabric of my shelter, I could see the beam of a flashlight moving around the campsite. "Everything okay?" I called out softly. "It's me," Christopher's voice came back. "Just need to take a leak." I listened as his footsteps moved away from the campsite toward the tree line. Then there was silence again. I waited for the sound of his return, but minutes passed without any sign of him. I was starting to get worried when I finally heard the zip of his tent opening and closing. The next morning, Christopher was still asleep when the rest of us began breaking camp. Michael had to shake him awake, and when he finally emerged from his tent, he looked haggard and exhausted, as if he hadn't slept at all. "You okay, man?" I asked him. "You look like hell." He blinked at me slowly, as if he was having trouble focusing. "Just didn't sleep well," he said. "Bad dreams." There was something odd about his voice, a flatness to it that wasn't like him at all. Christopher was usually animated, enthusiastic, the kind of person who talked with his hands and filled every conversation with energy. But this morning, he seemed almost catatonic. "What kind of dreams?" Jennifer asked with concern. Christopher stared at her for a long moment before answering. "I don't remember," he said finally. "Just darkness and cold." We hiked for most of the morning in relative silence, with Christopher lagging behind the group and seeming to have difficulty keeping up. He'd always been the most physically fit among us, but today he was moving slowly, stumbling occasionally on rocks or tree roots that should have been easy for him to navigate. It was around noon when Michael stopped abruptly and consulted his map and compass again. "This is weird," he said, frowning. "According to this, we should have reached the Penobscot River by now, but I don't see any water anywhere." I looked over his shoulder at the topographical map. He was right. the blue line indicating the river should have been just ahead of us. But all I could see was more forest, stretching endlessly in every direction. "Maybe we're off course," I suggested. "These old logging roads probably aren't marked very accurately." "No, that's not possible," Michael said, his voice taking on a note of panic. "I've been following the compass religiously. We should be exactly where this map says we are." Jennifer pulled out her GPS device, but the screen showed nothing but an error message. "No satellite signal," she said. "That's impossible. This thing works everywhere." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the October air. I pulled out my own phone and saw the same thing. No signal, no GPS, nothing. It was as if we'd somehow moved beyond the reach of modern technology. "Let's backtrack," Michael said, trying to keep the fear out of his voice. "We'll find the main trail and start over." But when we turned around and began retracing our steps, everything looked different. The path we'd followed that morning seemed to have vanished, replaced by dense forest that showed no signs of human passage. Even the terrain looked wrong. Hills where there should have been valleys, streams where the map showed dry land. "This doesn't make sense," Michael muttered, staring at his compass as if he could will it to show him the way home. "The needle is spinning. It's like there's some kind of magnetic interference." Christopher had stopped walking entirely and was standing motionless in the middle of the trail, staring off into the forest with an expression I couldn't read. When I approached him, I noticed that his pupils were dilated, and his skin had taken on a grayish pallor. "Chris, you okay?" I asked, putting a hand on his shoulder. He turned to look at me, and for a moment I didn't recognize the person behind his eyes. There was a hunger there, a predatory intelligence that was completely alien to the friend I'd known for 15 years. "I can hear them calling," he said in that same flat, emotionless voice. "They're so hungry." "They've been hungry for so long?" "Who's calling?" Jennifer asked, moving closer to Michael. "Chris, you're scaring me." But Christopher had already turned away and was walking toward the tree line, moving with a purposefulness that hadn't been there all morning. We called after him, but he didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that he'd heard us. "Should we follow him?" I asked Michael. "Give him a few minutes," Michael replied. "Maybe he just needs some space. He's been acting weird all day." But Christopher didn't come back. We waited for over an hour, calling his name and receiving no response. Finally, we decided to go after him, leaving our heavy packs behind and following his footprints into the dense forest. The tracks were easy to follow at first, clear boot prints in the soft soil, broken branches where he'd pushed through the underbrush. But after about a quarter mile, the trail became confusing. The footprints seemed to change, becoming longer and narrower, with what looked like claw marks at the toes. "What the hell?" Michael muttered, kneeling down to examine the tracks more closely. "These aren't from hiking boots." Jennifer was looking around nervously, clearly ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. "Maybe there was an animal following his trail," she suggested. "A bear or something." But even as she said it, we all knew that didn't explain what we were seeing. The tracks seemed to show a gradual transformation. Human footprints morphing into something else, something that walked on two legs but was no longer entirely human. The trail led us deeper into the forest, through terrain that became increasingly difficult to navigate. The trees here were older and larger than anything we'd seen before, their massive trunks blocking out most of the daylight and creating a perpetual twilight even though it was barely mid-afternoon. And the smell was getting stronger. That sickly sweet odor of rotting meat was now so intense that I had to breathe through my mouth to keep from gagging. Jennifer had pulled her shirt up over her nose, and even Michael, who prided himself on his outdoor experience, looked like he was struggling not to vomit. We found Christopher about 2 miles from where we'd left our packs. Or rather, we found what was left of him. He was hanging from a massive pine tree, about 15 feet off the ground, suspended by what looked like lengths of intestine that had been wrapped around the branches like rope. His body had been torn open from throat to groin, and most of his internal organs were missing. What remained was already beginning to attract flies, despite the cold October air. Jennifer screamed, a high, piercing sound that echoed through the forest and seemed to go on forever. Michael grabbed her and pulled her face against his chest, trying to shield her from the sight, but it was too late. We'd all seen what had been done to our friend. But the worst part wasn't the mutilation or the gore. The worst part was Christopher's face. His eyes were still open, staring down at us with an expression of terrible awareness. And his mouth was moving, lips working soundlessly, as if he was trying to tell us something. "He's still alive," I whispered, barely able to force the words out. Michael looked up at what remained of our friend and shook his head. "No, that's impossible. Look at him. He's been... But even as he spoke, Christopher's head turned slightly, tracking our movement with those horrible, knowing eyes. His mouth opened wider, and a sound came out. Not quite human, but not entirely animal either. It was the same howling we'd heard on our first night, but weaker now, more desperate. "We have to get him down," Jennifer said, her voice breaking. "We have to help him." "He's beyond help," Michael said grimly. Jesus Christ, what could have done this to him? I was staring up at Christopher's ruined body when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. There were bite marks on what remained of his torso, but they weren't from any animal I'd ever seen. They were human-sized, with human teeth, but far too large for any normal person, and the pattern of the bites suggested that whatever had attacked him had been trying to eat him while he was still alive. "We need to get out of here," I said, backing away from the tree. "Now. Whatever did this might still be around." As if summoned by my words, we heard movement in the forest around us. Not the sound of a single large animal, but multiple creatures moving through the underbrush, circling our position. And with the movement came voices, human voices, but distorted and wrong, speaking in a language I didn't recognize. "Run," Michael said, grabbing Jennifer's hand. "Run now." We crashed through the forest, abandoning any attempt at stealth in favor of speed. Behind us, the voices grew louder and more numerous, and I could hear the sound of pursuit. Branches breaking, heavy footsteps pounding through the underbrush, and always that terrible howling that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that twilight forest, where every tree looked the same and every direction led deeper into the nightmare. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out, until we finally collapsed in a small clearing beside a stream I didn't remember crossing before. "The packs," Michael gasped, trying to catch his breath. "We left all our gear back there." "Forget the packs," I said. "We need to find a way out of here." But even as I said it, I was beginning to suspect that escape might not be possible. Something was fundamentally wrong with this place. Beyond just the supernatural horror we'd witnessed, the landscape itself seemed to be shifting around us, changing when we weren't looking, keeping us trapped in an ever-expanding maze of trees and shadows. Jennifer was crying quietly, huddled against Michael for warmth and comfort. "What happened to Chris?" she whispered. "What could have done that to him?" I thought about the transformation we'd seen in his behavior, the way his personality had seemed to drain away overnight, leaving behind something cold and predatory. I thought about the tracks that had changed from human to something else, and the expression of terrible awareness in his dead eyes. "I don't think Christopher is really dead," I said finally. "I think something took him over, something that's been living in these woods for a very long time." Michael looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "That's impossible. You saw what happened to him. Nobody could survive that." "Then explain why he was still moving," I said. "Explain why his eyes were tracking us." Before Michael could respond, we heard it again. That horrible howling, but closer now, much closer. It was coming from the direction we'd run from, and it was answered by similar calls from at least 3 other directions. "They're hunting us," Jennifer whispered. "Whatever they are, they're hunting us like animals." I stood up and looked around the clearing, trying to find some kind of defensible position. The stream might offer some protection. Most predators were reluctant to cross running water, but as I approached the bank, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. The water was full of bones. Human bones, picked clean and bleached white tumbling along the bottom of the stream like pebbles, skulls and rib cages and long bones that could only have come from arms and legs. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, as if this stream had been used as a dumping ground for the remains of countless victims. "Oh, God," Jennifer breathed, seeing what I discovered. "How long has this been going on? How many people have they killed?" The howling was getting closer, and I could see shapes moving between the trees, tall, gaunt figures that walked upright but moved with an inhuman gait. In the fading light, I couldn't make out many details, but there was something wrong with their proportions, as if they'd been stretched and distorted beyond normal human limits. "The trees," Michael said suddenly. "We need to get up in the trees." It was our only option. We chose the largest pine we could find and began climbing, pulling ourselves up through the branches as quickly as we could manage. The bark was rough and sticky with sap, and the branches were spaced far apart, making the ascent difficult and dangerous. Below us, the creatures emerged from the forest. They had once been human. I could see that much even in the dim light. But they'd been changed, transformed into something else by whatever evil lived in these woods. They were impossibly tall and thin, with elongated limbs and fingers that ended in razor-sharp claws. Their skin was gray and mottled, stretched tight over protruding bones, and their faces were the worst part. The features were still recognizably human, but distorted, as if someone had taken a photograph and stretched it vertically. Their eyes were solid black, reflecting no light, and their mouths were full of too many teeth. Not just human teeth, but rows of sharp, pointed incisors like a shark's. And I recognized one of them. It was Christopher, but not Christopher. The thing that had been our friend was now 7 feet tall and skeletal thin, its clothes hanging in tatters from its emaciated frame. It moved with the same predatory grace as the others, and when it looked up at us hiding in the tree, I saw no trace of the person we'd known for 15 years. "Chris," Jennifer whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Oh God, Chris, what did they do to you?" The Christopher thing tilted its head at the sound of her voice, and its mouth opened in what might have been a smile. When it spoke, its voice was a horrible parody of our friend's familiar tone, stretched and distorted like everything else about it. "Jennifer," it said, drawing out the syllables. "Come down. I'm so hungry. We're all so hungry." The other creatures began to climb. They moved up the trunk with an inhuman agility, their clawed fingers finding purchase in the bark as easily as if they were walking on level ground. In seconds, they would reach us, and then it would be over. But as the first creature reached our level, something unexpected happened. A shotgun blast echoed through the forest and the thing's head exploded in a spray of black blood and brain matter. It fell backward, crashing through the branches to land with a wet thud on the forest floor. "This way!" a voice shouted from somewhere below. "Move your asses!" I looked down and saw a figure in hunting camouflage, carrying what looked like a military-style assault rifle. The man was older, probably in his 60s, with a grizzled beard and eyes that had seen too much. "Now!" he yelled, firing another burst at the creatures that were scrambling down from the tree to attack him. "Before more of them show up." We didn't need to be told twice. We half fell, half climbed down from the tree and ran toward our rescuer, who was already backing away from the clearing and firing controlled bursts at the pursuing creatures. "Name's Earl Dubois," he said as we ran. "Been tracking these things for 20 years. This way. I've got a truck about a mile from here." "What are they?" Michael gasped as we crashed through the underbrush behind him. "Wendigos," Earl said matter-of-factly, pausing to reload his weapon. "Started showing up in these woods back in the 80s. State tried to cover it up, said it was just bear attacks. But I knew better. I lost my son to them in '89. The name hit me like a physical blow. Wendigos, the cannibalistic monsters of Algonquian folklore, humans who had been transformed into something else by consuming human flesh during times of starvation. I'd read about them in college, dismissed them as primitive superstition. But the creatures pursuing us were exactly what the stories described. towering, gaunt figures with an insatiable hunger for human flesh. "How do we stop them?" I asked. "Silver bullets help," Earl said, ejecting a spent magazine and slapping in a fresh one. "But fire works better. They're afraid of fire." Behind us, the howling had resumed, but it was more distant now. Earl's truck turned out to be an ancient Ford pickup with a snowplow blade mounted on the front and steel mesh welded over the windows. It looked like something out of a post-apocalyptic movie, but I'd never been so happy to see a vehicle in my life. "Get in the back," Earl ordered, starting the engine, "and keep your heads down. The road out of here goes right through their territory." The drive back to civilization was the longest hour of my life. Several times we were forced to stop while Earl cleared fallen trees from the road, trees that had clearly been placed there deliberately, as if the Wendigos were trying to prevent anyone from leaving their territory. Twice, we saw glowing eyes watching us from the forest, and once something large and fast ran alongside the truck for nearly a mile before finally giving up the chase. Earl dropped us off at the state police barracks in Millinocket, but, as he'd predicted, the authorities were less than helpful. They took our statements with the bored efficiency of people who'd heard similar stories before and filed them away in a drawer that I suspected was already full of similar reports. "Probably got turned around in the woods," the sergeant said dismissively. "Happens all the time up there. People get lost, start seeing things. Stress and dehydration can cause hallucinations." "What about Christopher?" Jennifer demanded. "He's still out there. You have to send a search team." "We'll put out a bolo alert," the sergeant promised without enthusiasm. "But I have to tell you, if your friend is lost in the North Woods this time of year, the chances of finding him alive are pretty slim." We never saw Christopher again. Officially, he was listed as missing, presumed dead due to exposure. The state conducted a cursory search of the area, but they claimed they couldn't find any trace of our campsite or the trail we'd followed. According to them, there was no logging road where Michael's map showed one, and no record of any path leading into that particular section of wilderness. It's been 8 months since that trip, and I still wake up screaming most nights. Jennifer and Michael moved to California shortly after we returned, unable to cope with the memories. I've tried to move on, tried to convince myself that Earl was right, and what we experienced was some kind of mass hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. But I know what I saw. I know what happened to Christopher, and I know those things are still out there, waiting in the North Woods for the next group of hikers to wander too far from the marked trails. Sometimes, late at night when the wind is howling outside my apartment, I think I can hear them calling, that same mournful, almost human sound that we heard on our first night in the forest. And sometimes, I think I hear Christopher's voice among them, stretched and distorted but still recognizable, calling my name and asking me to come back, to come home. I've been thinking about it more and more lately, about going back to those woods, about finding that clearing where we saw Christopher hanging from the tree. Maybe I could bring him back somehow. Maybe I could save him. The hunger is getting stronger every day. I can feel it growing inside me, gnawing at my insides like a living thing. I know it's not natural, know it's not right, but I can't seem to make it stop. Raw meat looks more appealing every time I go to the grocery store. The smell of my neighbor's cooking dinner makes my mouth water in ways that have nothing to do with normal appetite. And sometimes when I look in the mirror, I swear my reflection looks taller, thinner, wrong. I don't think I'm going to be able to fight it much longer. The Wendigo curse, if that's what it is, seems to be spreading, transmitted by exposure to those creatures in the woods. Earl warned us about this before he drove away, told us to watch for the signs, but I thought I'd escaped. I thought I was one of the lucky ones. I was wrong. I can feel myself changing, becoming something else, something hungry, something that belongs in those dark woods with the others of its kind. If you're reading this, stay away from the North Woods of Maine. Stay away from the unmarked trails and the remote clearings, and if you hear howling in the night, don't investigate. Don't try to help. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because once the Wendigos notice you, once they start hunting you, there's no escape. You'll either die screaming in those woods, or you'll become one of them, doomed to spend eternity stalking through the darkness, searching for your next meal. I'm going back to the woods tomorrow. I can't fight the hunger anymore, and I know where I belong now, with my friend Christopher and all the others who've been claimed by the ancient evil that lives in those trees. Maybe I'll see you there someday. Just remember to run. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the North Maine woods, deep in the Allagash Wilderness Waterway, where the trees grow so thick they swallow sound and the darkness between them seems to breathe. David Jones and I had been planning this hunting trip for months. We'd been friends since college, both of us office workers desperate to escape the fluorescent-lit cubicle farms that had become our lives. David worked in accounting for a paper mill in Bangor, while I pushed insurance claims in Portland. Every year, we promised ourselves we'd get back to nature, back to something real. This October, we finally did it. The plan was simple. 5 days in the wilderness, hunting deer and maybe catching some brook trout if we found time. We'd rented a small cabin near Churchill Lake, about as remote as you could get without needing a bush plane. The nearest town, Allagash, was 40 miles of dirt logging roads away, and even that was barely a dot on the map with maybe 50 year-round residents. I should have paid more attention to the locals when we stopped for supplies. The old man at Pelletier's trading post, a weathered building that looked like it had been there since the lumber baron days, kept staring at us while we loaded up on canned goods and batteries. His name was Marcel, according to the faded badge pinned to his flannel shirt, and his French-Canadian accent was so thick I had to ask him to repeat things twice. "You boys heading up to Churchill?" he asked, his roomy eyes fixed on our hunting licenses. "That's right," David replied, always the friendly one. "Got a cabin rented for the week." Marcel's face darkened. He glanced toward the back of the store where an ancient woman sat behind the counter, her fingers working steadily at some kind of beadwork. She looked up at us with eyes like black water, then quickly looked away. "You be careful up there," Marcel said quietly, "especially after dark. Things different this time of year." David laughed it off, but I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something in the old man's voice, a weight that suggested he'd seen things he couldn't easily explain. "Different how?" I asked. Marcel exchanged a look with the woman. She shook her head almost imperceptibly. "Just be careful," he repeated. "And if you hear anything moving around your cabin at night, don't go outside, no matter what it sounds like." The drive to the cabin took 3 hours on increasingly rough roads. David chatted about work, about his girlfriend Sarah, about the 8-point buck he was sure he was going to bag. I found myself only half listening, my mind stuck on Marcel's warning. The deeper we drove into the woods, the more oppressive everything felt. The trees seemed to lean inward over the road, creating a tunnel of red and gold that, beautiful as it was, felt somehow wrong. Our cabin sat on a small rise overlooking Churchill Lake. It was basic. 2 bedrooms, a main room with a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen, and an outhouse about 50 yards into the woods. No electricity, no running water, no cell service. Exactly what we'd wanted, or thought we'd wanted. The first night was perfect. We grilled steaks over an open fire, drank beer, and talked about old times. The lake reflected the stars like scattered diamonds, and an owl called from somewhere across the water. For the first time in months, I felt the knots in my shoulders begin to loosen. "This is the life," David said, poking at the fire with a stick. "I could live like this." "Until winter," I pointed out. "Then you'd be begging for central heating and high-speed internet." "Maybe, but wouldn't it be something? Really living, I mean, not just existing in some corporate maze." I had to admit the idea appealed to me. The silence was incredible. A deep, living quiet that you never found in the city. Even the small sounds seemed amplified, the pop and crackle of the fire, the gentle lap of water against the shore, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. It was while we were sitting there that I noticed the cold spot. The night was crisp but not unpleasant, maybe 40 degrees. The fire was putting out good heat, warming my face and chest, but there was a patch of air, maybe 6 feet behind me, that felt significantly colder. Not just cool, genuinely cold, as if someone had opened a freezer door. I turned to look, but saw nothing except darkness between the trees. "You feel that?" I asked David. "Feel what?" I gestured behind me. "Cold spot, like an air conditioning vent." David stood and walked over to where I was pointing. He stood there for a moment, then shrugged. "Feels normal to me. Maybe it's a breeze off the lake." But there was no breeze. The air was perfectly still. We turned in around 11, banking the fire and making sure all our food was secured in the bear canister David had insisted on bringing. The cabin felt warm and secure, our sleeping bags laid out on the rustic bunk beds. David was snoring within minutes, but I lay awake listening to the night sounds. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were soft, barely audible, like someone trying very hard not to be heard. They seemed to circle the cabin slowly, pausing at each window. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped directly outside my window. I waited, heart hammering, for what felt like an hour. No sound, no movement. Finally, I crept to the window and peered out through a gap in the curtains. Nothing. Just darkness and the faint shimmer of starlight on the lake. In the morning, David found the tracks. "Mike, come look at this," he called from outside. I pulled on my boots and joined him near the corner of the cabin. In the soft earth, clearly visible in the morning light, were footprints. They were human-shaped but wrong somehow. Too long, with what looked like claw marks at the tips of the toes. They circled the entire cabin, just as I'd heard the night before. "What the hell is that?" I asked. David knelt beside one of the clearer prints. "I don't know. Maybe a bear? They can leave tracks that look almost human sometimes." But we both knew bears didn't walk upright for extended distances, and bears didn't stop and listen at windows. "Maybe we should head back," I suggested. "This doesn't feel right." David looked at me with disbelief. "Because of some weird footprints?" "Come on, Mike. We drove 3 hours to get here. We're not going home on the first day because you're spooked." He was right, of course. I was being paranoid. There had to be a logical explanation for the tracks. A person, maybe. Another hunter playing a prank, or someone checking on the cabin to make sure we weren't causing damage. We spent the day hiking and scouting for deer sign. The woods were beautiful but strangely quiet. We saw no animals larger than a squirrel, heard no bird song. Even the insects seemed muted. David attributed it to hunting pressure. Other hunters in the area had probably spooked everything for miles around. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It started as just a prickle between my shoulder blades, the primitive awareness that eyes were upon us. As the day wore on, it intensified. Several times I spun around, sure I'd catch sight of whatever was following us, but saw only trees and shadows. "You're jumpy today," David observed as we made our way back to the cabin in the late afternoon. "Something's off about this place," I said. "Can't you feel it?" David stopped walking and looked at me seriously. "Mike, what's going on? You've been acting weird all day." I tried to put it into words. "It's too quiet. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. It's like the whole forest is holding its breath. So we picked a quiet spot. That's good for hunting." "This isn't quiet, David. This is dead." He didn't understand, and I couldn't blame him. David had always been practical, evidence-based. He dealt in numbers and facts, not feelings and intuition. But my gut was screaming that something was wrong, and every instinct I had was telling me to get as far away from this place as possible. That night, I made sure the fire was built up high and bright. I'd read somewhere that most predators avoided fire, and while I wasn't sure what we were dealing with, I figured it couldn't hurt. "You're acting like a scared kid," David said, but not unkindly. "It's just the woods, man. Same woods that have been here for thousands of years." "That's what I'm afraid of," I muttered. We played cards by firelight and tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but I couldn't concentrate. Every shadow beyond the fire's reach seemed to shift and move. Every creak of the cabin settling sounded like footsteps. Around midnight, our phones died. Both of them simultaneously. They'd been at nearly full charge when we went to bed the night before, and we'd barely used them since there was no signal anyway. But when David tried to check the time, his phone was completely dead. So was mine. "Weird," David said. "Must be the cold." But it wasn't that cold, and modern phones were built to handle much worse conditions. Then our GPS units started acting up. David had brought 2 handheld GPS devices as backups, both loaded with detailed topographic maps of the area. When we turned them on the next morning, they showed our location as being about 30 miles southeast of where we actually were, somewhere in the middle of Baxter State Park. "That's impossible," David said, frowning at the display. "These things are accurate to within 3 feet." I tried the other unit, same result. According to both devices, we were nowhere near Churchill Lake. "Equipment failure," David said firmly. "Has to be. Maybe solar activity or something." But I'd noticed something else. The paper topographic map we'd brought as a final backup was also wrong. Not obviously wrong. All the major features were in the right places, but the small details were different. Streams that should have been to our east were shown flowing to the west. The cabin we were staying in wasn't marked at all, even though the rental company had assured us it was on all official maps. "David," I said slowly, "I think we need to leave. Now." "Why? Because some electronics are malfunctioning?" "It's not just the electronics. Look at the map. Really look at it." David studied the paper map for several minutes. I watched his confidence waver as he realized what I was seeing. This has to be the wrong map," he said finally. "We must have grabbed the wrong one before we left. Check the title." He looked at the header. "Churchill Lake and surrounding area," he read aloud. His voice was uncertain now. "That's the right map, David, but it's wrong." We spent the morning trying to figure out where we actually were. Every landmark we found contradicted what the map showed. The small stream that should have been to our north was flowing south. The Beaver Dam marked on the map was in the wrong location entirely. The hiking trail that was supposed to connect our area to the main logging road seemed to have vanished. "We're lost," I said. "That's impossible. We drove straight here on marked roads." "Then explain this." I gestured at the useless map, the dead electronics, the landscape that refused to match what it should be. David couldn't. For the first time since I'd known him, David Jones, logical, practical David, had no explanation. That afternoon, we decided to hike back to the main road. It should have been a 3-hour walk due south. We started early, taking most of our gear in case we couldn't find our way back to the cabin. We walked for 6 hours and never found the road. The sun was setting when we finally admitted we were completely lost. Nothing looked familiar. The terrain was rougher than it should have been, full of ravines and rock outcroppings that hadn't been there on our way in. Worse, we'd been walking generally downhill for most of the day, but according to our recollection, the road should have been uphill from the lake. "This is insane," David said, breathing hard. "It's like the whole landscape has shifted." I didn't say what I was thinking, that maybe it had. We made camp in a small clearing beside a stream that wasn't on any map. David built a fire while I tried to figure out where we were using the stars, but even the constellations seemed wrong. Not completely different, but shifted somehow, as if we were looking at them from somewhere else entirely. "Mike," David said quietly, "do you hear that?" I stopped what I was doing and listened. At first, I heard only the normal sounds of the woods at night, the stream, the wind in the trees, the pop and hiss of our fire. Then I heard it. Breathing, a slow, deliberate breathing, just beyond the edge of our firelight. It was too deep and too steady to be human, but too rhythmic to be an animal. It seemed to come from all directions at once, as if the forest itself was breathing. "What is that?" David whispered. I grabbed a burning branch from the fire and held it out toward the darkness. The breathing stopped immediately, but I could feel something watching us. Multiple somethings just outside the reach of our light. We spent the night back to back, feeding the fire constantly and jumping at every sound. Neither of us slept. As dawn approached, the watching presence seemed to withdraw, but slowly, reluctantly. When full daylight came, we found the tracks. They surrounded our campsite in perfect concentric circles, as if whatever had been watching us had spent the entire night walking around and around our fire. The prints were the same as the ones we'd found at the cabin, human-shaped but elongated, with claw marks at the tips. But these were fresh, and there were dozens of them. "We need to find that cabin," David said. His face was pale and his hands shook as he broke down our makeshift camp. "We need to get our stuff and get out of here." But we couldn't find the cabin. We spent the entire day searching for it, following streams and ridgelines that should have led us back to Churchill Lake. Nothing looked right. It was as if the landscape had been rearranged overnight, like pieces of a puzzle put back together in the wrong order. By evening, we were exhausted, scared, and completely lost. We'd eaten the last of our trail food that morning, and our water was running low. Worse, David was starting to crack under the pressure. "This isn't possible," he kept saying. "You can't just lose a lake. Lakes don't move." "David, we need to focus on getting out of here." "But how? How do you navigate when the landmarks keep changing? How do you escape from a place that doesn't follow any rules?" I didn't have an answer for that. We made camp beside another stream as darkness fell. This time, David was too shaken to help much with the fire or food preparation. He sat on a log, staring at our useless map and muttering to himself. "The GPS coordinates," he said suddenly. "What if they were right? What if we're actually in Baxter State Park? David, that's 30 miles away. We couldn't have walked that far. But what if space? What if distance doesn't work the same way here?" I didn't like the direction his thoughts were heading. David was the anchor of logic that had kept me steady since we'd arrived. If he lost it completely, I wasn't sure either of us would make it out alive. That's when we heard the voice. It came from across the stream, barely audible above the water's babble. A woman's voice, calling for help. "Hello," it called. "Is someone there? Please, I need help." David and I looked at each other. The voice sounded genuinely distressed, desperate. "Help me," the voice called again. "I'm hurt." "We should help her," David said, starting to stand. I grabbed his arm. "David, no. Think about it. What are the odds of finding another person out here, especially at night? She could be another hiker, someone else who got lost. Or it could be whatever's been watching us." The voice called again, closer now. "Please, I can see your fire. I've been lost for days." David pulled free of my grip. "I'm not going to ignore someone who needs help." "David, wait!" But he was already heading toward the stream, a flashlight in his hand. I watched the beam of light bob through the darkness as he made his way down to the water's edge. "Hello," he called. "Where are you?" The response came from directly across the stream, maybe 20 feet away. "Here. Oh, thank God. I thought I was going to die out here." I couldn't see anything in the darkness beyond David's flashlight beam, but I could hear movement in the brush. It sounded wrong somehow. Too fluid, too quiet for a person struggling through thick undergrowth. "What's your name?" David called. "Sarah," the voice replied. "Sarah Mitchell. I've been lost for 3 days." I felt ice in my veins. Sarah was David's girlfriend's name. What were the odds that we'd encounter someone with the same name, out here in the middle of nowhere? "David," I called, "come back." "It's okay," he shouted over his shoulder. "She's hurt. I'm going to help her across." "David, think. What are the chances?" "I can't make it across," the voice interrupted. "The current's too strong. Can you come over here?" David was already wading into the stream. The water was only knee-deep, but the current was swift and the rocks were slippery. I watched him struggle to keep his footing as he made his way across. "David, stop!" I screamed. "It's not human." But he couldn't hear me over the sound of the rushing water. Or maybe he didn't want to hear me. The practical, logical David Jones was gone, replaced by someone desperate enough to believe in coincidences that defied all reason. He made it across and disappeared into the thick brush on the far side. I could still see his flashlight beam moving between the trees, but I couldn't see him. "David," I called. "Can you see her?" No response. The light stopped moving. For a long moment it stayed perfectly still, pointing up at an odd angle as if David had dropped the flashlight. Then it went out. "David!" Silence. Even the stream seemed to quiet, as if the forest was holding its breath. I waited, calling his name every few minutes for over an hour. No response, no light, no sound from across the water except the rustle of wind in the leaves. I knew I should go after him. Every instinct of friendship and loyalty demanded that I cross that stream and find him. But a deeper, more primitive instinct kept me rooted in place. Something had taken David. Something that could mimic human voices and knew exactly which name would make him drop his guard. I spent the rest of the night feeding the fire and trying to come up with a plan. Every option seemed hopeless. I was lost in a landscape that refused to stay consistent, being hunted by something that could think and plan and deceive. My only friend was gone, probably dead, and I had no idea which direction might lead to safety. As dawn broke, I heard David calling my name. "Mike! Mike! Where are you?" The voice came from downstream, maybe 100 yards away. It sounded exactly like David. Same tone, same inflection, even the slight nasal quality he'd had since breaking his nose in college. "David?" I called back. "Mike, I found a way out. Come here." I started toward the voice, then stopped. Something was wrong. David had been across the stream when he'd disappeared. How had he gotten downstream on my side without me seeing him? "Where have you been?" I shouted. "I've been calling for you all night. I'll explain when you get here. Just follow my voice." I did follow it, but carefully, staying far enough back that I could retreat if necessary. The voice led me through thick underbrush and around several large boulders. I caught glimpses of movement ahead, a figure in clothes that looked like David's, walking just at the edge of my vision. "David, slow down! I can't keep up!" The figure stopped beside a large pine tree. I approached cautiously, my heart hammering. It was David. Same height, same build, same hiking clothes he'd been wearing the night before. But something was off. He stood, too still, like a mannequin arranged in a natural pose. His back was to me, and he didn't turn around when I approached. "David?" He turned slowly, too slowly, as if his neck was stiff. It was David's face, but empty. The features were all correct, but there was nothing behind the eyes. No recognition, no personality, no David. It was like looking at a perfect mask. "I found the way out, Mike," he said in David's voice, but his lips didn't quite sync with the words, like a badly dubbed movie. "What happened to you last night?" "Nothing happened. I'm fine. Come with me." He turned and started walking again, still with that unnatural stiffness. I followed at a distance, my skin crawling. This thing looked like David and sounded like David, but it wasn't David. David would have asked why I looked terrified. David would have wanted to know what I thought had happened to him. David would have been angry that I hadn't come after him immediately. This thing just wanted me to follow. We walked for what felt like hours. The terrain became increasingly rough and unfamiliar. I began to suspect that the David thing was leading me deeper into whatever nightmare the forest had become, farther from any hope of escape. That's when I made my decision. The next time the David thing stopped to wait for me, I didn't approach. Instead, I backed away slowly, trying to put distance between us. "Where are you going, Mike?" it asked, still not quite getting the lip sync right. "Just checking something." "Come back. We need to stay together." But I was already turning to run. I crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and face, not caring about noise or direction. I just needed to get away from that thing wearing my friend's face. Behind me, I heard the David thing calling my name. But as I got farther away, the voice began to change. The tone deepened, became more guttural. By the time I was 100 yards away, it didn't sound human at all. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. When I finally stopped, I was in a small clearing I'd never seen before. A circle of standing stones surrounded a depression in the earth that looked like it had been burned repeatedly. The stones were covered in symbols that looked like some kind of writing, but not from any alphabet I recognized. At the center of the circle, something glinted in the afternoon sunlight. David's watch. The Timex his father had given him for graduation. I'd seen him check it 100 times during our trip. I approached the circle cautiously. The watch lay in the exact center of the burned area, the metal band twisted and blackened as if it had been exposed to intense heat. Around it, scattered in the ash, were small fragments of bone. Human bone. I understood then what had happened to David, what was probably happening to others who ventured too deep into these woods. Something ancient lived here, something that fed on human flesh and could wear the faces of its victims like masks. A Wendigo. The word came to me unbidden, a half-remembered fragment from some documentary about Native American folklore. A cannibalistic creature that could mimic human appearance, growing larger and hungrier with each victim it consumed. The locals had tried to warn us, Marcel at the trading post with his careful words and worried glances. But we'd been too smart, too modern to listen to old superstitions. Now David was dead, and I was trapped in a forest that seemed to rearrange itself at will, being hunted by something wearing his face. I grabbed the watch and ran. The thing that looked like David found me again at sunset. I'd been trying to navigate by the sun, heading consistently west in hopes of eventually hitting a road or settlement. But the landscape kept shifting, valleys appearing where hills should be, streams flowing uphill, paths that led in circles despite feeling straight. "Mike!" the David thing called from behind me. "Why did you run away?" I didn't answer. I just kept walking, hoping to stay ahead of it until full dark. Maybe then I could hide. "I'm hurt, Mike. I need your help." I glanced back. The David thing was maybe 50 yards behind me, walking with an exaggerated limp, but its movements were still wrong. Too fluid, like it was gliding rather than walking. "Please, Mike. My leg is broken. I can't make it out of here alone." The thing was getting better at mimicking David's speech patterns, but it still didn't understand human emotion. The real David would have been furious that I'd abandoned him. He would have demanded explanations, accused me of cowardice. This thing just kept asking for help in a calm, reasonable voice. As darkness fell, I found a small cave, more of an overhang really, and crawled inside. The opening was barely wide enough for me to squeeze through, which meant anything larger would have trouble following. I hoped. The David thing found me within an hour. "Mike, I know you're in there. Why won't you help me?" I pressed myself against the back wall of the cave and tried not to breathe. "I'm your friend, Mike. I've always been your friend." Through the narrow opening, I could see a figure silhouetted against the stars. It was David's shape, but somehow wrong. Too tall, or too thin, or bent at angles that human joints couldn't achieve. "We were going to go hunting together. Remember? Just like old times." The voice was losing its human quality again, becoming deeper, more resonant. There was a hunger in it now that made my skin crawl. "I'm so hungry, Mike, so very hungry." Something scraped against the cave opening. Claws on stone. "Let me in, Mike. Let me in and I'll make it quick." I found a rock the size of my fist and gripped it tightly. If the thing tried to squeeze through the opening, I'd smash its skull. Or try to, anyway, but it didn't try to enter. It just waited outside, occasionally calling my name or making small talk in David's voice. As the night wore on, the voice became less and less human until it was just a series of grunts and growls that somehow still formed words. "Meek, hungry, so hungry." I must have dozed off sometime before dawn because I woke to silence. Pale morning light filtered through the cave opening. I listened for several minutes before carefully crawling out. The thing was gone, but it had left evidence of its presence. Deep claw marks scored the rocks around the cave entrance, and pressed into the soft earth nearby was a single footprint, human-shaped but nearly 2 feet long, with toes that ended in razor-sharp claws. I had to get out of these woods. Whatever was happening here, whatever laws of reality had been suspended, I couldn't survive much longer. The thing that had been David would find me eventually, and when it did, there wouldn't be enough left to fill a watch band. I started walking again, this time paying attention to more than just direction. The wrongness of the landscape had a pattern to it. Small changes that accumulated over time rather than dramatic shifts. A tree that was slightly taller than it should be, a rock formation that was the wrong color, streams that flowed just a few degrees off from where they should. It was as if the forest was slowly transforming, becoming something alien and hostile. And at the center of it all was the thing that wore David's face, growing stronger and more real with each passing hour. By midday, I developed a theory. The Wendigo, for that's what I was certain it was, didn't just kill its victims. It somehow absorbed them, took on their appearance and memories. But the process was gradual, imperfect. That's why it moved wrong, why its speech was off, why it couldn't quite capture David's personality. The question was, how long before it perfected the disguise? How long before it became indistinguishable from the real David? I got my answer that afternoon. "Mike, thank God." I spun around to see David running toward me through the trees. This time, everything was perfect. His gait, his expression, even the way he held his shoulders when he was excited. "I've been looking for you everywhere," he said, breathing hard. "What happened? One minute I was helping that woman across the stream. The next minute I woke up in some kind of cave. There was blood everywhere, Mike. Something killed that woman, tore her apart." It was a perfect performance. The right level of confusion, the appropriate emotional response, even the slight tremor in his voice that David got when he was scared but trying not to show it. If I hadn't seen David's watch in that burned circle, if I hadn't found the bone fragments, I might have believed it. "David," I said carefully, "what's Sarah's last name?" "What? Why are you asking me that?" "Just answer the question." He looked confused, hurt. "Thompson. Sarah Thompson." "Mike, what's wrong with you? You look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah Thompson. That was correct. The thing had David's memories now, at least the important ones. "Prove you're really David," I said. "What the hell is wrong with you?" "Of course I'm David. We've been friends for 15 years. We went to state together. You were the best man at my wedding to—" He stopped. "Wait, I'm not married. What am I saying?" A crack in the facade. David had never been married, and Sarah was his girlfriend, not his wife. The thing was mixing up memories, combining David's experiences with something else. "You're not David," I said, backing away. The thing's expression shifted slightly. The confusion was gone, replaced by something colder, more calculating. "Of course I'm David. Who else would I be?" "David is dead. You killed him." The thing smiled. It was David's smile, but there was something predatory about it now, something hungry. "Prove it," it said. That's when I ran. The chase lasted for hours. The thing that looked like David was faster than a human should be, but it seemed to be toying with me, staying just close enough to keep me terrified but never quite catching up. Every time I thought I'd lost it, I'd hear David's voice calling from just behind me. "Mike, why are you running from me?" "I'm your friend, Mike. I'm hurt. Please help me." As the sun began to set, I realized I was going to die. I was exhausted, dehydrated, and completely lost. The thing behind me showed no signs of fatigue. It could probably keep this up all night, wearing me down until I collapsed from exhaustion. That's when I saw the smoke. A thin column rising from somewhere ahead, barely visible against the darkening sky. Someone had a fire, which meant civilization, or at least other people. I changed direction and pushed myself toward it, using the last of my strength. The smoke led me to a small cabin, much like the one David and I had rented. Light flickered in the windows and I could smell cooking food. I stumbled up to the door and pounded on it. "Help! Please, someone help me!" The door opened to reveal an elderly Native American man. His weathered face showed no surprise at finding a desperate stranger on his doorstep. "You're being hunted," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, there's something in the woods, something that—" "I know. Come inside." "Quickly." He pulled me into the cabin and immediately began checking the windows and doors, making sure they were securely latched. The interior was sparse but comfortable, with a stone fireplace providing warmth and light. "My name is Joseph Atayan," the man said. "I've been waiting for you." "Waiting for me?" "For someone like you, someone who'd encountered Wendigo and lived to tell of it." Wendigo? I'd been right about what we were dealing with. "Your friend is dead," Joseph continued. "Has been since the first night. What you've been running from is Wendigo wearing his skin." "How do you know all this?" Joseph pointed to a wall covered in photographs. They showed dozens of missing people. Hikers, hunters, campers. All of them had disappeared in these woods over the past several decades. "I used to guide hunters and fishermen through this area," Joseph said. "Stopped after I realized what was happening. But someone needs to warn people. Try to help the few who make it this far." Outside, I heard David's voice calling my name. "Mike, I know you're in there. Come out and face me." Joseph handed me an old rifle. "Iron bullets," he said. "Blessed by my grandfather, who was a medicine man. They won't kill Wendigo, but they'll hurt it enough to drive it off." "Why don't you kill it?" "Because it's not just one creature anymore. Every person it consumes makes it stronger, adds to its knowledge and abilities. By now, it's dozens of people, maybe hundreds, and it's smart enough to avoid direct confrontation with someone who knows how to hurt it." The calling outside was getting closer, more insistent. "Let me in, Mike. I'm hurt. I'm bleeding." "It can't enter uninvited," Joseph explained. "But it'll wait. It has all the time in the world." "So, what do we do?" Joseph looked grim. "We wait for dawn. Wendigo is weaker in daylight. Then I'll guide you out of these woods, show you the path it can't follow." "Why can't it follow?" "Because the path leads through sacred ground, land that was blessed by my ancestors centuries ago when Wendigo first came to these woods. The creature can't set foot there. We spent the night listening to the thing outside. It tried dozens of different voices. David pleading for help, David screaming in agony, David promising that everything would be okay if I just came outside. Sometimes it used other voices too, people I didn't recognize, victims from years past. Near dawn, it tried one final gambit. "Mike!" This time it was my mother's voice. "Mike, honey, it's Mom. I'm hurt. Please help me." My mother had been dead for 10 years. When the first rays of sunlight crept through the windows, Joseph stood and gathered his gear. Time to go. The path he led me on was unlike any trail I'd ever seen. It wound through the forest following no apparent logic, sometimes doubling back on itself, sometimes leading through terrain that should have been impassable. But Joseph seemed to know exactly where he was going. "The old ones laid this path," he explained as we walked. "Follows the ley lines, the natural energy of the earth. Wendigo is a creature of corruption, of hunger without purpose. It can't tolerate places of true spiritual power." Behind us, I occasionally heard crashes in the underbrush, as if something large was following but couldn't get close. We walked for 6 hours before emerging onto a paved road, a real road, with painted lines and mile markers and the distant sound of traffic. "This will take you back to Allagash," Joseph said. "From there, you can find your way home." "What about you?" "I go back. Someone needs to watch, to help the next person who stumbles into Wendigo's territory." "You can't stop it?" Joseph shook his head. "Wendigo is part of the natural world now, as much as the trees and the streams. All we can do is try to limit the damage, save who we can. I wanted to argue, to insist that we call the authorities, bring in the National Guard, something, but I knew it would be useless. Who would believe such a story? And what could modern weapons do against something that had been terrorizing these woods for centuries? "Your friend," Joseph said as I prepared to leave. "He died quickly. Wendigo was still learning, still clumsy. He wouldn't have suffered long. It was meant to be comforting, but it wasn't. David was dead because I hadn't listened to my instincts, because I'd let him walk into the darkness. That was something I'd have to live with for the rest of my life." I started walking down the road toward town. When I turned back to thank Joseph, he was gone. The path we'd emerged from had vanished as well, leaving only thick forest that looked like it had never been disturbed by human passage. It took me 3 days to convince the authorities to search for David. They found our rental cabin along with his gear and personal effects, but they never found David himself, or any trace of what had happened to him. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead due to animal attack or accidental injury. I didn't correct them. What would have been the point? I moved away from Maine 6 months later. Couldn't stand the thought of being so close to those woods, knowing what was still out there, wearing my friend's face and waiting for the next group of hikers to lose their way. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear David's voice calling my name, and I wonder if somewhere in that vast, hungry darkness, the thing that killed him is still growing stronger, adding new faces to its collection, new voices to its repertoire. The North Maine woods are vast and beautiful, full of wonders that most people will never see. But there are places in those woods where people shouldn't go, where the normal rules don't apply. If you ever find yourself lost in the wilderness and something starts calling your name with a familiar voice, don't answer. And whatever you do, don't go outside after dark.